Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is William Craddock, but everyone calls me Bill. I've been a forest ranger here in the Cherokee National Forest for 16 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Wildfires that could swallow whole valleys, flash floods that turned peaceful creeks into raging monsters, and search and rescue operations that pushed me to my limits. In all that time, I'd rescued 47 people from situations that should have killed them. I grew up in these hills, just like my daddy and his daddy before him. We Craddocks have always been mountain folk, scratching out a living from the hard ground and harder times. When the mine took my father in '48, I swore I'd find work that kept me above ground, breathing clean air instead of coal dust. The Forest Service gave me that chance, and I never looked back. Devil's Backbone Ridge has always been my territory. It's a narrow spine of rock and trees that connects two peaks about 30 miles from the nearest town. Most folks avoid it. Too remote, too dangerous, with drop-offs that'll kill you if you take one wrong step. But I know every trail marker, every rock formation, every weather pattern that rolls through these hollows. My grandmother used to tell stories about the backbone when I was little. Tales about hollow men who walked the ridge at night, stealing souls from anyone foolish enough to camp there alone. She'd sit in her rocking chair, working her knitting needles and spinning yarns about Confederate soldiers who never found their way home from the war. I always figured they were just stories meant to keep curious children from wandering too far into the wilderness. I should have listened to her. It was late October of 1963 when everything changed. The leaves had turned their brilliant reds and golds, but there was something wrong with the weather. An unseasonable fog had settled over the mountains, thick and gray and cold. It hung in the valleys like smoke, refusing to burn off even when the sun climbed high. The temperature kept dropping too, 20 degrees colder than it should have been for that time of year. That's when the Henderson brothers came stumbling into my ranger station, white as sheets and talking nonsense about empty men walking the ridge. They were experienced hunters, the kind of men who could track a deer through snow and find their way home in the dark. But here they stood, shaking like leaves and begging me to go back for their gear. "We ain't going back up there, Bill," the older brother, Tom, kept saying. "Something ain't right about that place, something that don't belong." His younger brother, Pete, just nodded and stared at his boots. "Saw them walking in the fog," he whispered. "Men without faces, wearing old gray clothes. They were coming toward our camp, moving like they had all the time in the world." I've heard a lot of stories from scared campers over the years. Bears that sound like camp, monsters in the dark, wind through the trees that sounds like voices, shadows that look like creatures when you're tired and spooked. Usually, I can calm folks down with a cup of coffee and some common sense. But the Henderson brothers were different. These were men who'd been hunting these woods since they were boys. If something had scared them this bad, it was worth checking out. "I'll head up there tomorrow," I told them. "Probably just some drifters looking for a place to camp. Nothing to worry about." But even as I said it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Something in the way Pete's hands shook when he reached for his coffee cup. Something in the way Tom kept glancing toward the windows, like he expected to see those empty men pressing their faces against the glass. I spent the rest of that evening checking my equipment. Radio, first aid kit, flares, my service pistol, standard gear for a search and rescue operation. I told myself it was routine, just another day on the job. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was preparing for something else entirely. That night, I dreamed about my grandmother's stories for the first time in 20 years. I hiked up to Devil's Backbone the next morning, following the trail markers I'd installed myself 5 years earlier. The fog was even thicker than it had been the day before, rolling between the trees like something alive. My breath steamed in the cold air, and I had to stop twice to button my jacket tighter. The Henderson brothers' campsite was exactly where they said it would be, set up in a small clearing about halfway along the ridge. But what I found there made my blood run cold. Their tent was still standing, but the flaps hung open like a gaping mouth. Inside, Their sleeping bags were laid out neat and tidy, like they'd just been made. No signs of a struggle, no indication they'd left in a hurry. Their cooking gear was cleaned and stacked by the cold fire pit. Even, their food was still hanging in a bear bag, untouched. But their clothes were gone, not stolen, arranged. I found Tom's hunting jacket spread out on the ground about 50 yards from camp, arms outstretched like he'd been crucified. Pete's boots were placed heel to heel in a perfect line, pointing toward the ridge. Their pants and shirts were folded and stacked on a flat rock, with their socks rolled up and placed on top like an offering. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. In 16 years of search and rescue, I'd never seen anything like it. People don't fold their clothes and arrange them in patterns when they're running for their lives. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. That wasn't unusual. The mountains played hell with radio signals, but something about the static bothered me. It wasn't the usual crackling and popping you'd expect. It sounded almost like whispers, too faint to make out the words. That's when I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, no squirrels chattering in the trees or wind rustling through the leaves. Just dead, heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums like water. In all my years in these woods, I'd never heard such complete quiet. Even in the depths of winter, there was always some sign of life. I checked my compass, thinking maybe I could find tracks leading away from the camp. The needle spun lazily in circles, unable to find magnetic north. I tapped the glass, figuring it was broken, but the needle kept spinning. Iron deposits, I told myself. The ridge had plenty of iron ore in the rock. That had to be what was throwing off the compass. Just a natural magnetic anomaly. But even as I made excuses, I knew something was wrong. The cold was getting worse, seeping through my jacket like it was made of paper. My breath came out in thick clouds, and I could feel frost forming on my mustache. I decided to follow the ridge and look for more signs of the Henderson brothers. Maybe they'd panicked and run, leaving their clothes behind in their hurry to get away. People did strange things when they were scared. The trail along the ridge was narrow, with steep drop-offs on both sides. Normally, I could walk it with my eyes closed, but the fog made everything different. Landmarks I'd known for years seemed shifted, turned around. Trees appeared where I didn't remember them being, and rocks jutted out of the ground at odd angles. That's when I saw the first footprint. It was pressed into a patch of soft earth beside the trail, clear as day. A man's boot, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. But here's what made me stop and stare. The print was only half there. It started normal at the toe, but by the heel, it had faded to almost nothing, like whoever made it was becoming transparent as they walked. I knelt down and studied it closer. The deeper part of the print was ice cold, cold enough to make my fingers ache when I touched it. And there was something else, a smell like old copper pennies and wet earth. I followed the trail of half-prints for about 100 yards. They led toward a thick stand of laurel bushes that grew right up to the edge of the ridge. The prints got fainter with each step, until they disappeared entirely just before the laurels. I pushed through the bushes, thorns catching at my jacket and scratching my hands. On the other side was a small clearing I'd never seen before, which was impossible. I'd mapped every inch of this ridge. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, each one about the size of a man's head. They were arranged in a perfect ring, with a flat rock in the middle, like an altar. The stones were old, covered in moss and carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Cherokee maybe, but different from anything I'd seen in the museums. And lying on the altar rock was Pete Henderson's wallet. I picked it up with shaking hands. His driver's license was still inside, along with a picture of his wife and 2 kids. $37 in cash. A hunting license dated just 3 days ago. Everything normal, except for the temperature. The wallet was so cold it burned my fingers, like I'd grabbed a chunk of ice. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, soft as wind through dry leaves. I spun around, but the clearing was empty. Just the ring of stones and the laurel bushes and the fog that seemed to press closer with each passing moment. "Hello," I called out. "Tom? Pete? If you're out there, answer me." The whisper came again, and this time I could almost make out words. It sounded like someone calling my name, but from very far away, or very long ago. I stuffed the wallet in my pocket and got out of that clearing as fast as I could. I should have hiked back down the mountain right then, should have called for a full search and rescue team, maybe even the state police. But something kept me on that ridge, something I couldn't name. Maybe it was professional pride. I'd never left a searching complete. Maybe it was stubbornness, the Craddock family trait that had gotten us in trouble for generations. Or maybe something was already calling to me, drawing me deeper into the fog. I spent the next 2 hours searching every trail and clearing I could find. The Henderson brothers were nowhere to be seen, but I kept finding their things. Tom's hunting knife stuck point first into a tree trunk, so deep I couldn't pull it out. Pete's canteen hanging from a branch 20 feet off the ground, empty and ice cold. A can of beans with the label peeled off and the metal bright as new silver. Each item was colder than the last, and the fog kept getting thicker. By 3 o'clock, I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees, and my breath came out in thick, white clouds. I'd put on my heaviest jacket, but the cold seemed to seep right through it, settling in my bones like an ache. That's when Jake Morrison showed up. Jake was my partner ranger, assigned to the southern section of the forest. He was a good man, steady and reliable, with 20 years of experience in these mountains. I heard his boots on the trail before I saw him, and relief flooded through me like warm coffee. "Bill," he called out through the fog. "Heard you might need some help up here." I walked toward his voice, grateful to have another person around. But when I got close enough to see him clearly, something made me stop. Jake looked normal enough, same ranger uniform, same weathered face, same easy smile. But his eyes were different, flat and gray, like stones at the bottom of a pond. "How'd you know I was up here?" I asked. "Radio," he said. But I knew that was impossible. My radio hadn't worked all day. "Jake, we need to get off this ridge. Something's not right up here. The Henderson brothers are missing, and I've been finding their gear scattered all over the mountain." He nodded and smiled, but the expression didn't reach those flat gray eyes. "Sure thing, Bill. But first, let me show you something. Found it about a quarter-mile back." He led me off the main trail, deeper into the fog. I followed, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and run. Jake's footsteps were too quiet, barely making a sound on the rocky ground. And he wasn't breathing hard, even though we were climbing uphill through thick brush. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked. "Just up ahead," he said without turning around. "You'll want to see this." His voice sounded strange too. Not quite Jake's voice, but close enough to fool someone who wasn't paying attention. The words had an odd rhythm to them, like he was speaking a foreign language and translating as he went. We climbed for another 10 minutes through laurel thickets that tore at my clothes and scratched my face. Jake moved through them like smoke, never getting caught on a branch or stumbling on the uneven ground. The fog got so thick I could barely see his back, but I could hear him walking just ahead of me. Finally, we emerged into another clearing, this one much larger than the first. The fog was thinner here, like it was being held back by some invisible force. I could see the sky for the first time in hours, dark gray clouds rolling overhead like a storm was coming. In the center of the clearing was a depression in the ground, maybe 20 feet across and 6 feet deep. It was perfectly round, like someone had carved it out with giant tools. And at the bottom, I could see bones. Human bones, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, bleached white and scattered like leaves. Skulls and rib cages and long arm bones, all mixed together in a pile that rose almost to ground level. "Found it about an hour ago," Jake said, but his voice came from Armand, the wrong direction. I spun around and saw him standing on the opposite side of the pit, even though he'd been right beside me a second before. "What is this place?" I whispered. "Mass grave," he said, and now his voice definitely wasn't Jake's. It was older, rougher, with a southern accent that belonged to a different century. From the war, deserters mostly, men who tried to run when the fighting got too hot, they brought them here to die. I backed away from the pit, my hand moving instinctively to my service pistol. "Jake, what's wrong with you? You're talking funny." He laughed, but it wasn't Jake's laugh. It was bitter and cold and full of pain. "Jake ain't here no more, Ranger. Jake's sleeping down there with the rest of them, dreaming dreams he'll never wake up from." That's when I saw the change happen. Jake's face began to blur and shift, like I was looking at him through water. His skin became pale and waxy, and his eyes sank deeper into his skull. His ranger uniform faded to gray, the fabric changing texture until it looked like old wool, Military issue from 100 years ago. "You've been walking our ridge all day," the thing that looked like Jake said. "Walking where you don't belong. Touching what ain't yours to touch. Time to pay the price, Ranger man." I drew my pistol and pointed it at him, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it steady. "What did you do with Jake? Where is he?" "Same place you're going," the hollow man said. "Same place we all go when the fog comes calling." More shapes began to emerge from the fog around the clearing. Tall, thin men in tattered gray uniforms, their faces gaunt and their eyes like empty holes. They moved without sound, gliding over the ground like they weighed nothing at all. There were dozens of them, maybe more, surrounding the pit of bones. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees. Frost began forming on the trees, and my breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see through them. The hollow men watched me with their empty eyes, waiting. "Run," one of them whispered, and I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a command. I ran. I crashed through the laurel thickets like a madman, branches tearing at my face and clothes. Behind me, I could hear them following, not footsteps, but something worse. A sound like wind through dry leaves, or paper rustling, or bones clicking together in the cold. My flashlight died after 5 minutes, even though I'd put fresh batteries in that morning. The fog pressed against me from all sides, so thick I had to feel my way from tree to tree. Every shadow looked like one of them. Every sound made me jump and spin around with my pistol ready. I must have run for an hour, completely lost in the gray nothing. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. The whispers followed me, getting closer and closer, calling my name in voices like rustling paper. "William," they said. "William Craddock. Time to come home, William." I stumbled into another clearing, this one smaller than the mass grave, but somehow more terrible. Here the fog was so thin it was almost like being underwater, everything wavering and strange. In the center was a single tree, ancient and gnarled, its branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Hanging from those branches were more clothes. Dozens of sets, maybe hundreds, stretching back through the decades. I saw modern hiking gear next to wool coats from the 1942nd, military uniforms from different wars, women's dresses that looked like they belonged in museums. All of them empty, hanging like the shed skins of invisible people. And there, on a low branch where I couldn't miss it, was Jake Morrison's Ranger uniform. I reached up with shaking hands and touched the fabric. It was ice cold and stiff as cardboard, like it had been frozen solid. Jake's name tag was still pinned to the chest, bright and new, but the uniform was empty, holding nothing but cold air and the smell of wet earth. "He's with us now," a voice said behind me. I turned around and there he was, the real Jake, or what was left of him. His skin was pale as milk, and his eyes were empty black holes. He wore the same gray uniform as the others, tattered and stained with old blood. When he spoke, frost came out of his mouth instead of breath. "Been waiting for you, Bill," he said. "We all have. Need someone to take our place, someone to stand guard while we rest." More of them emerged from the fog, surrounding the tree of empty clothes. I recognized some of the faces from old missing person reports. Hikers who'd vanished over the years, hunters who'd never come home. They all wore the same gray uniforms now, all had the same empty eyes. "What are you?" I whispered. "Hollow men," Jake said, and his voice was like wind through a graveyard. "Lost souls looking for a way home. Been walking this ridge since 1863, when they shot us for desertion. Been stealing breath from the living, trying to fill the emptiness inside." I raised my pistol, but my hand was shaking so bad I could barely aim. "Stay back, I'm warning you." They laughed, all of them together, and the sound was like ice cracking on a frozen pond. "Bullets can't hurt us, Bill. We're already dead. Have been for 100 years. The cold was getting worse, seeping into my bones like poison. I could feel it trying to steal my breath, my warmth, my life. The hollow men stepped closer, reaching out with fingers like icicles. That's when I remembered my grandfather's stories. Joseph Crow Feather had been Cherokee, married to my grandmother back when such things were scandalous in these parts. He'd told me stories about the old ways, the protective rituals his people used against evil spirits. I'd always thought they were just tales, but standing there in that clearing with death reaching for me, I was willing to try anything. I pulled out my pocket knife and cut my palm, letting blood drip onto the frozen ground. Then I began to chant the words my grandfather had taught me when I was 10 years old. Cherokee words I hadn't spoken in 20 years. The hollow men stopped moving. Their empty eyes widened with something that might have been fear. "He knows the old words," one of them whispered. "He carries the protection." I kept chanting, mixing Cherokee with fragments of prayers my grandmother had taught me. The blood from my cut hand steamed when it hit the ground, melting the frost in a small circle around my feet. "You have no power here," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "This is sacred ground, protected by older laws than yours. Go back to your graves and leave the living alone." For a moment, I thought it might work. The hollow men wavered like smoke, their forms becoming translucent. The fog began to thin, and I could see stars appearing overhead. But then Jake stepped forward, and his empty eyes burned with cold fire. "Cherokee magic," he said. "Strong, but not strong enough. We've been here too long, Ranger Man. Fed on too many souls. Your grandfather's words can't save you now." He reached out with one gray hand and touched my forehead. The cold hit me like a sledgehammer, driving me to my knees. I felt something vital and warm begin to drain out of me, flowing into his empty form like water through a broken dam. This was how I was going to die. Alone on a cursed ridge, my soul stolen by dead Confederate deserters. My body would join the others in that mass grave, and my uniform would hang from this tree until another ranger came looking for me. But as the cold crept toward my heart, I felt something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with blood or breath. My grandmother's voice, speaking Cherokee words that burned the fog away like sunlight. My grandfather's hands, placing protective symbols in my mind. And, deeper than that, older than my family's memories, I felt the mountain itself rising to help me. The Cherokee had been here for thousands of years before the war, before the deserters, before the hollow men. Their protection was woven into the very stones and trees. I grabbed a handful of dirt from the sacred ground beneath my feet and threw it at Jake's hollow face. Where it touched him, he screamed and began to dissolve. The other hollow men fell back, their forms wavering like candle flames in a strong wind. "Iron!" I gasped, remembering another piece of my grandfather's teachings. Cherokee buried their dead with iron to keep the spirits bound. I pulled out my service pistol and fired 3 shots into the air, the iron bullets scattering metal fragments through the fog. The hollow men shrieked and scattered like leaves in a hurricane. The fog began to clear, and warm air rushed in to replace the bone-chilling cold. The tree of empty clothes withered and cracked, its branches falling to the ground like broken bones. The gray uniforms crumbled to dust, and the empty eyes finally closed. In the sudden silence, I heard a sound that was the most beautiful thing in the world. Birds singing in the dawn light. I found Jake Morrison 3 hours later, unconscious but alive at the bottom of a ravine half a mile from the clearing. He had no memory of how he'd gotten there, no recollection of the past 3 days. The doctors said it was hypothermia and shock, maybe a head injury from a fall. I didn't argue with their diagnosis. The Henderson brothers' bodies were never found, but their truck was discovered at the bottom of a steep cliff, 20 miles away. The state police ruled it an accident, driver error on a foggy mountain road. The insurance companies paid out, and their families moved away from the mountains. I never told anyone what I'd really seen in that clearing. The area around Devil's Backbone Ridge was officially closed to the public 6 months later. Geological instability, the Forest Service said. Danger of rock slides and cave-ins. I was the one who recommended the closure, and I made sure the paperwork went through fast. But I go back every October when the moon is full, carrying Cherokee salt and iron tokens my grandfather taught me to make. I walk the ridge from end to end, checking the protective barriers, making sure the hollow men stay in their graves where they belong. Jake transferred to a different forest that spring. Said these mountains gave him bad dreams, made him feel like he was being watched. He's doing good work in Colorado now, helping tourists and fighting wildfires. Sometimes he sends me postcards with pictures of snow-covered peaks. He never mentions Devil's Backbone, and I never bring it up in my letters back. I started learning Cherokee from an elder named Joseph Crow Feather. It turned out he was my grandfather's nephew, though I'd never known we had family still living in the area. He teaches me the old protective rituals, the the songs that keep evil spirits bound, the proper way to honor the dead so they don't come walking back. Your grandfather was wise to teach you even a little, Joseph told me. Most white folks, they forget the old ways, think science and machines can protect them from everything. But some evils are older than science. Some things require older solutions. The Forest Service gave me a commendation for bravery in the Henderson brothers case. They said I'd gone above and beyond the call of duty, risking my life to search for missing persons in dangerous terrain. I accepted the medal and the handshake, but I didn't feel brave. I felt like a man who'd looked into hell and barely escaped with his soul intact. 3 more people have gone missing on or near Devil's Backbone Ridge since 1963. Hikers who ignored the warning signs, teenagers on dares, a documentary filmmaker who thought he could debunk the local legends. Each time, I organized the search parties and filed the reports. Each time, we found their gear scattered and arranged in ritual patterns, ice cold and touched by something that shouldn't exist. The bodies are never recovered. The files are quietly closed after a few months, and every October, when the fog rolls in thick and gray and cold, I hear the whispers starting again. If you're ever driving through the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee, you'll see the signs warning people away from Devil's Backbone Ridge. Geological hazard, they say. Stay on marked trails. Do not enter closed areas. Listen to those signs. Trust an old ranger who's seen what happens to people who don't. Some places are closed for good reason. Some hungers can never be satisfied. And some men have been dead so long they've forgotten how to stay buried. The hollow men are still up there, waiting in the fog, waiting for someone foolish enough to camp alone on harvest moon nights, someone who doesn't carry iron or know the old protective words. Don't let it be you. My name is Margaret Thornberry, but everyone calls me Maggie. I've been a park ranger here in the Pisgah National Forest for 11 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, flash floods, you name it. But what happened on Roan Mountain in June of 1971 changed everything I believed about this place. I'm a botanist by training, not just some weekend nature lover. I've got a degree from NC State and 3 published papers on rare Appalachian plants. I discovered a new species of trillium just 2 years back. The point is, I know these mountains like the back of my hand, especially the high country around Roan Mountain. Roan Mountain is special. At 6,000 feet, it's one of the few places in the South where you can stand above the tree line and see for miles. The Cherokee called it sacred ground, and I always understood why. When the rhododendrons bloom in June, the whole mountainside turns pink and white like someone spilled paint across the world. But there's something else about Roan Mountain that most people don't know. Scattered across the bald summit are these stone circles, not natural rock formations, but carefully arranged stones that the Cherokee placed there centuries ago. The old stories say the stones sing, that they call to people. I always figured it was just the wind whistling through the gaps between rocks. Sound can do funny things at that altitude. That's what I told myself anyway, until the morning Dr. James Kellerman didn't come back from his research trip. Jim was a botanist from Duke University, studying the rare plants that grow only on these high mountain balds. Good man, careful researcher. He'd been camping up there for 3 days, collecting samples of the Gray's lily that blooms nowhere else in the world. When he missed his radio check-in 2 days running, I hiked up to find him. The weather had been strange that week. June is usually clear and mild up there, perfect for research work, but we'd been getting these sudden thunderstorms that seemed to come out of nowhere, rolling across the bald like they were hunting for something. The air itself felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I found Jim's camp exactly where it should be, but something was wrong. His tent was still zipped up tight, his equipment laid out neat as you please, but Jim was nowhere around. His radio was on the ground next to his sleeping bag, crackling with static. When I picked it up, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a low humming sound, almost like singing coming through the speaker. I spent 3 hours calling his name, following his marked research trail. The weird thing was, all his plant samples were still in their collection bags, but they were arranged in perfect spirals around the stone circles. Jim was too professional to leave his work scattered like that, and the plants themselves looked strange. Too green, too perfect, like they were growing faster than they should. That's when I found him. Jim was lying in the center of the largest stone circle, arms spread wide like he was making snow angels. At first I thought he was just unconscious, maybe hit by lightning during one of those sudden storms. But when I got closer, I could see his eyes were wide open, staring straight up at the sky. His skin was gray as ash, and when I touched his wrist to check for a pulse, his arm crumbled like old paper. The stones around him were humming. Not the wind. I know what wind sounds like. This was different, like a choir of voices too low to hear but loud enough to feel in your chest. The sound seemed to come from inside the stones themselves, vibrating up through the ground and into my bones. I've seen plenty of dead bodies in my time as a ranger. Heart attacks, falls, hypothermia. But I'd never seen anything like what happened to Jim Kellerman. It was like something had sucked all the life right out of his mint. Tim left nothing but a shell that fell apart at the touch. I radioed for help, but the static on my radio was so bad I could barely get through. Every time I tried to call, that low humming sound would start up again, drowning out everything else. Finally, I gave up and hiked back down to the ranger station to call for a recovery team. But when we came back the next morning with the medical examiner and 3 other rangers, Jim's body was gone. The only thing left was a perfect outline in the grass where he'd been lying, and every blade of grass inside that outline was dead. The medical examiner said maybe animals had carried off the remains, but I knew better. No animal would touch something that wrong. And animals don't arrange plant samples in perfect geometric patterns around ancient stone circles. That night, lying in my bunk at the ranger station, I could still hear the humming in my head. Soft and low, like a lullaby someone might sing to help you sleep forever. 3 days after we found Jim's camp, Dr. Sarah Whitman showed up at my office. She was an anthropologist from Appalachian State, studying Cherokee sacred sites. Tall woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd heard about Jim's disappearance through the university network and wanted to know what I'd seen up there. The Cherokee have stories about those stone circles. She told me over coffee in the station break room. They called them spirit traps, places where the ancestors bound dangerous earth spirits to protect the sacred mountain. I nearly choked on my coffee. You're telling me you believe in ghost stories? I believe in patterns, she said, and the pattern here is that people have been disappearing around those stones for over 100 years. The Cherokee stopped using that particular site for ceremonies sometime in the 1800s. The elders said the spirits had grown hungry. Dr. Whitman had done her homework. She showed me newspaper clippings going back to the 1,920 hikers found dead in the stone circles, always during rhododendron season. Always with that same gray, drained look I'd seen on Jim. The bodies that were found anyway. More often, people just vanished completely. The Cherokee believe the spirits trade places, she explained. They've been trapped in those stones for centuries, but during certain times of year, when the mountain is at its most alive, they can reach out. They take the life force from the living and use it to try to escape their prison. It sounded crazy, but I kept thinking about those plant samples arranged in perfect spirals, about the humming sound that seemed to come from inside the stones themselves. And I kept thinking about how Jim's body had just crumbled away like it had been dead for years instead of days. Against my better judgment, I agreed to take Dr. Whitman up to the stone circles. She wanted to document the site, take measurements, maybe record some of the acoustic phenomena I'd described. I figured having a witness along would be good, and honestly, I needed to go back up there anyway. The whole thing was eating at me. We hiked up on a Thursday morning in late June. The rhododendrons were in full bloom, covering the mountainsides in clouds of pink and white flowers. Beautiful day, clear skies, gentle breeze, perfect hiking weather. Dr. Whitman brought all kinds of equipment, cameras, a tape recorder, electromagnetic field detectors, even a seismograph to measure ground vibrations. The stone circles looked innocent enough in the bright morning sunlight. Just old rocks arranged in rough circles, probably 10 feet across each. There were 5 of them scattered across the bald, with the largest one in the center where I'd found Jim. The grass inside the circles was still dead, forming perfect brown rings in the green mountain meadow. Dr. Whitman set up her equipment while I poked around the edges of the site. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. New plant samples, arranged in the same spiral patterns I'd seen before. Fresh ones, still dewy from the morning air. But we were the first people up here since the recovery team had left. "Sarah," I called out, "you need to see this." She came over with her electromagnetic detector, which was beeping like crazy. "The readings here are off the charts," she said. "It's like there's a massive electrical field coming from underground." That's when we heard the humming. It started soft, so low you felt it more than heard it. Dr. Whitman's tape recorder picked it up immediately, the needle jumping into the red zone. The sound seemed to be coming from all 5 stone circles at once, a harmonic vibration that made the air itself seem to shimmer. "Are you getting this?" I asked, but Dr. Whitman didn't answer. She was staring at the largest stone circle, with a strange expression on her face, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. The humming got louder, and I started to feel dizzy. The rhododendron blooms around us began to sway, even though there wasn't any wind. They were moving in rhythm with the sound, like they were dancing to music only they could hear. "Sarah?" I reached out to touch her shoulder, but she stepped away from me, walking slowly toward the center stone circle. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The electromagnetic detector in her hand was shrieking now, the needle pinned all the way to the right. But Dr. Whitman didn't seem to notice. She was walking straight toward the dead grass in the center of the circle, the same spot where I'd found Jim's body. That's when I saw them, shapes moving inside the stones, like heat mirages on a summer road. They flowed and shifted, pressing against the rock from the inside like they were trying to get out. The humming got so loud I had to press my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound, I was coming from inside my head now. Dr. Whitman stepped into the dead circle. The moment her foot touched the brown grass, every rhododendron bloom on the mountainside turned to face her. Thousands of flowers, all moving at once, all pointed at the stone circle like a crowd watching a performance. The humming rose to a pitch that made my teeth ache. And Dr. Whitman started to change. Her hair began to turn gray, not the natural gray of aging, but the dead gray of ash. Her skin grew pale and tight, like it was shrinking on her bones. But the worst part was her eyes. They stayed bright and aware, full of terror, even as her body began to wither. She was trying to scream, but no sound came out except that awful humming. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a handful of gravel and threw it at the nearest stone. The rock bounced off with a sound like breaking glass, and suddenly the humming stopped. Dr. Whitman collapsed to her knees in the center of the circle, gasping for air. The rhododendron blooms snapped back to their normal positions. The shapes inside the stones faded away. But when I helped her to her feet, I could see that something had been taken from her. She looked older, more fragile, like she'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds. And when she tried to speak, her voice came out as a whisper. "They're so hungry," she said. "They've been waiting so long." We left the mountain that day, but I knew we'd be back, because whatever was in those stones wasn't done with us yet. Dr. Whitman spent 2 days in the hospital after our trip to the stone circles. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her, but she'd lost 15 pounds and her hearing in her left ear. She insisted it was just exhaustion, but I could see the fear in her eyes every time someone mentioned going back up the mountain. I should have listened to that fear. Instead, I let my curiosity get the better of me. The problem was, people were starting to ask questions. Word had gotten out about Jim Kellerman's disappearance, and now there were reporters calling the ranger station, university researchers wanting to visit the site, even some ghost hunters from Asheville asking for permits to camp up there. I couldn't let civilians wander into whatever was happening on Roan Mountain, so I went back alone. This time I brought better equipment, a shortwave radio, flares, enough supplies for 3 days. I figured if I could document what was really happening up there, maybe I could find a way to stop it, or at least keep people away until I figured out what we were dealing with. I set up camp about a quarter mile from the stone circles, close enough to observe but far enough away to feel safe. That first night, nothing happened. I sat by my fire, watching the circles through binoculars, but they just looked like old rocks in the moonlight. The second night was different. I woke up around midnight to the sound of my radio crackling. Static at first, then slowly resolving into that low humming sound I'd heard before. But this time, there were voices mixed in with the humming, whispers in a language I didn't recognize, rising and falling like wind through trees. Cherokee. It was Cherokee, spoken with accents so old they sounded like they came from another world entirely. I grabbed my binoculars and looked toward the stone circles. They were glowing. Not bright, just a soft phosphorescence like foxfire on rotting logs. The light pulsed in rhythm with the voices on the radio, and I could see shapes moving between the stones. Tall figures that seemed to be made of mist and moonlight, circling the dead grass where Jim had died. One of them looked right at me. Even from a quarter mile away, I felt its eyes lock onto mine. The thing raised what might have been an arm and pointed straight at my camp. The voices on the radio got louder, more urgent, and suddenly I understood what they grief. Were saying, even though I don't speak Cherokee. Come home, come home, come home. My campfire went out all at once, like someone had thrown a bucket of water on it. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, and something started walking toward me through the darkness. I couldn't see it clearly, just a shape that was darker than the night around it. But I could hear its footsteps in the grass, slow and deliberate, getting closer with each beat of my heart. The voices on the radio were chanting now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all calling me home to a place I'd never been. I ran, stumbled through the darkness with my flashlight beam dancing crazily ahead of me, crashed through rhododendron thickets, and tripped over rocks. But I didn't stop until I reached the tree line. Only then did I look back. The stone circles were blazing with cold fire now, bright enough to see from miles away. The shapes dancing around them had multiplied, filling the entire bald with their ghostly forms. And in the center of it all, in the largest circle, I could see a figure that looked almost solid, almost human. It was wearing a park ranger uniform. It was Jim Kellerman, or what was left of him. He raised one gray hand and waved at me, and his mouth opened in a smile that was too wide, too full of teeth that glowed like the stones around him. The voices on my radio laughed. I didn't sleep that night. I hiked straight back to the ranger station and locked myself in my office until sunrise. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, about Jim standing in that circle, part of whatever was haunting the mountain now. The next day, Dr. Whitman showed up at my door. She looked terrible, thinner than before, her hair gone completely white, but her eyes were determined. I talked to my grandfather, she said. He's Cherokee, from the old families that remember the stories. He told me what we're dealing with. She sat down across from my desk and pulled out a leather-bound notebook filled with handwritten Cherokee words and their English translations. They're not evil spirits, she said. They're ancestors, Cherokee warriors who volunteered to be bound to the mountain to protect it from something worse. But the binding was supposed to be temporary, just until the real threat passed. They've been trapped there for over 200 years, and they're desperate to be free. Free to do what? I asked. To pass on to the spirit world where they belong. But they can't leave unless someone takes their place. That's why they drain the life from people who enter the circles. They're trying to create new guardians so they can finally rest. I thought about Jim's gray, crumbling body, about the way Dr. Whitman had aged in those few seconds inside the circle. So they're killing people to escape? They're trying to trade places with the living. But it doesn't work the way they think it will. The people they drain don't become guardians. They just become part of the hunger. That's why Jim is still up there. He's trapped between life and death, helping them hunt for more victims. Dr. Whitman leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. My grandfather says there's only one way to stop them. Someone has to go up there and perform the release ceremony, set them free the proper way. But it has to be done during the peak of their power, when the mountain is most alive. When's that? She looked at me with those haunted eyes. Tomorrow night, during the new moon, when the rhododendrons reach full bloom. I knew what she was asking. I knew it was probably suicide. But I also knew that if we didn't do something, more people were going to die. And maybe, just maybe, we could put Jim's spirit to rest. What do we need? I asked. Dr. Whitman smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Tobacco, white sage, cedar branches, and more courage than any sane person should have. The spirits of Roan Mountain had been waiting over 200 years for freedom. Tomorrow night, we were going to give it to them. Or die trying. Dr. Whitman's grandfather was named Thomas Swimmer, and he was the oldest man I'd ever met. He must have been 90 if he was a day, but his eyes were sharp as flint, and his hands steady as he showed us how to prepare for the ceremony. "The spirits are not your enemy," he told us in his small cabin near Cherokee. "They are warriors who sacrificed everything to protect the sacred mountain. But their sacrifice was never meant to be eternal. They grow angry because they have been forgotten, abandoned to guard against a threat that passed long ago." He taught us the proper words, the right way to hold the sacred tobacco, how to arrange the cedar branches around the circle. Most importantly, he warned us about what we would face. "They will test you," he said. "They will try to make you afraid, to make you run. They have been alone so long that they do not trust easily. You must show them that you come in peace, that you remember their sacrifice." "What if they don't believe us?" Dr. Whitman asked. Old Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Then you will join them in their prison, and the mountain will have new guardians whether it needs them or not." We drove back to Roan Mountain as the sun was setting. The whole way up, Dr. Whitman clutched the leather pouch of ceremonial tobacco like her life depended on it. Maybe it did. The rhododendrons were in full bloom, more beautiful than I'd ever seen them. Every flower seemed to glow in the twilight, and the air was thick with their sweet scent. But underneath that sweetness was something else. The smell of old earth and older secrets, of things that had been buried but never truly died. We hiked up to the stone circles by headlamp, our footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The mountain felt different tonight, more alive somehow. The shadow seemed to move. Every breeze carried whispers in languages I didn't understand. The stone circles were waiting for us. They weren't glowing yet, but I could feel the power building in them like electricity before a storm. The dead grass in the center of each circle was perfectly preserved, brown and brittle after all these weeks, and scattered around the largest circle were fresh bones, white and clean, like they'd been picked by careful hands. "Jim," Dr. Whitman whispered. I nodded. The spirits had been feeding well. We set up the ceremony exactly as Thomas Swimmer had taught us, cedar branches at the 4 directions around the largest circle, white sage burning in a small fire at the center, and the sacred tobacco offered to the spirits with the ancient words that Dr. Whitman pronounced carefully in Cherokee. For a long time, nothing happened. We sat by our small fire, speaking the ritual words over and over, calling to the trapped ancestors with promises of freedom and respect. The moon rose, thin as a blade, casting everything in silver light. Then the humming started. It came from deep underground this time, so low it was more vibration than sound. The stone circles began to glow with that cold fire I'd seen before, and the shapes started forming inside the rocks. But tonight they looked different, more solid, more real, and there were so many of them. Dozens of Cherokee warriors in traditional dress, their faces painted for war, their eyes blazing with centuries of anger and loneliness. They moved around the circles like they were dancing, but their dance was full of rage and desperate hunger. In the center of the largest circle, Jim Kellerman stood watching us. He looked more solid than the others, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. His park ranger uniform was rotting on his body, and his face was the gray color of old bone. When he smiled, his teeth were black as tar. "You came back," he said, and his voice was the sound of wind through a graveyard. "I knew you would. The mountain calls to its own." "We're here to help, Doctor," Whitman said, standing up with the tobacco pouch in her hands. "We know about the binding. We know you've been trapped here against your will." The Cherokee warriors stopped their dancing and turned to look at us. Their eyes were like holes in the world, dark and hungry and full of pain that went back generations. "Help?" Jim laughed, and the sound made the stones ring like bells. "You want to help? Then join us. Take our place. Let us finally rest." "That's not how it works, Doctor," Whitman said firmly. "The binding can be broken properly, with honor, the way it was meant to be. You don't need to trap new guardians. You just need to be released." The warriors began to move again, but this time they were moving toward us. Jim stepped out of the circle, his feet leaving gray prints in the grass, and I could see the hunger in his dead eyes. "Too late," he whispered. "Too late for ceremonies and pretty words. We are so hungry, and you are so alive." The temperature dropped like a stone. Our breath came out in white puffs, and frost began to form on the grass around us. The warriors were getting closer, reaching out with hands that looked like gray mist but felt real enough to kill. That's when Dr. Whitman did something I'll never forget. She stepped into the largest stone circle. The moment her feet touched the dead grass, every warrior froze. Jim's gray face twisted with confusion. The humming stopped so suddenly that my ears rang with the silence. "I offer myself freely," Dr. Whitman said in Cherokee, her voice carrying across the mountain clear as a bell. "Not as a prisoner, but as a willing guardian. Let these spirits pass to their rest, and I will take their place." "No!" I shouted, but it was too late. The stones erupted with light so bright it burned my eyes. When I could see again, Dr. Whitman was changing. But not the way Jim had changed. Her gray hair turned white as snow, and her eyes began to glow with the same cold fire that burned in the stones. But she didn't look dead or drained. She looked ancient and powerful, like she was becoming something more than human. The Cherokee warriors were fading, their shapes growing thin and translucent. I could see joy on their painted faces, relief that went back centuries. They were finally free to pass on to whatever waited beyond. Jim was the last to go. As his gray form began to dissolve, his face changed back to the way I remembered him, kind and human and at peace. He looked at me one last time and mouthed the words "thank you" before fading away like morning mist. The stone circles went dark. The mountain fell silent, except for the normal sounds of night, wind in the grass, an owl calling somewhere in the distance. But Dr. Whitman remained, standing in the center of the circle like a statue carved from moonlight. "Sarah?" I called out. She turned to look at me, and I saw that her eyes held depths I couldn't understand. She was still Dr. Whitman, but she was something else too, something that belonged to the mountain now. "I'm all right," she said, and her voice carried echoes of wind and stone. "I chose this. The mountain needs a guardian, and I'm honored to serve." "For how long?" She smiled, and for a moment she looked like the woman I'd known. "Until someone else chooses to take my place, or until the mountain no longer needs protection. However long that might be." I stayed with her until dawn, but when the sun came up, she faded away like the warriors before her. The stone circles were just old rocks again, and the grass in the center was beginning to turn green. But I knew she was still there, watching over the sacred mountain, keeping it safe from those who would misuse its power. I filed my report with the Park Service the next week, called it an unstable geological formation, and recommended that the area be closed to public access indefinitely. "Too dangerous for civilian hikers," I said. "Risk of sudden rock slides and toxic gas emissions from underground mineral deposits." They bought it. The stone circles were marked as a hazard zone and fenced off with warning signs. Most people stay away now, which is exactly what Dr. Whitman, what the Guardian, wants. But I go back sometimes. Usually during rhododendron season, when the mountain is at its most beautiful, I hike up to the edge of the restricted area and leave offerings of tobacco and sage near the fence. Traditional gifts, the way Thomas Swimmer taught me. And sometimes, if the light is just right and the wind is blowing from the east, I can see her moving among the stone circles. She looks peaceful, content in a way she never did in life. The mountain has accepted her as its protector, and she has accepted the mountain as her eternal home. The Cherokee stories were right. Some places are too sacred, too powerful, to be left unguarded. Dr. Whitman understood that in the end. She knew that someone had to stay, someone had to watch, someone had to keep the mountain safe from those who would disturb its ancient secrets. I've been thinking about retirement lately. 11 years in these mountains has taught me a lot about the balance between the seen and unseen worlds, about the debts we owe to those who came before us. Maybe when my time comes, I'll hike back up to those stone circles one last time. Maybe I'll understand what Dr. Whitman understood, is at death, that some things are worth protecting, even if the cost is everything you thought you knew about life and death. The Cherokee called it duty. I call it love. Either way, the mountain will have its guardian. And the spirits of the ancestors will continue to rest in peace, knowing that their sacrifice was not forgotten, that their long watch finally came to an end. But if you ever find yourself hiking in the North Carolina mountains during rhododendron season, and you hear stones singing in the wind, turn around and walk away. Some songs are not meant for the living to hear. The mountain remembers everything, and it's always watching. Always. My name is Daniel Kirkpatrick, but everyone just calls me Dan. I've been a park ranger in the Cranberry Wilderness area of West Virginia for 13 years now. In that time, I've rescued 73 lost hikers, tracked down poachers, and dealt with more black bear encounters than I care to count. I know every trail, every shelter, and every dangerous drop-off in these mountains like the back of my weathered hands. People often ask me why I chose such a lonely job. The truth is, I came here looking for peace after Vietnam. The war left me with too many memories I'd rather forget, and these quiet mountains seemed like the perfect place to leave all that behind. For more than a decade, that plan worked just fine. I've always been what you'd call a practical man. When folks started talking about Mothman sightings around Point Pleasant back in the 60s, I just rolled my eyes. Big birds, I figured. Maybe a sandhill crane blown off course, or just people getting worked up over. Nothing. Mass hysteria happens more than you'd think. After all, I'd spent 13 years in these woods without seeing anything stranger than an albino deer. The Cranberry Wilderness is about as remote as it gets in West Virginia. We're talking 40 miles from the nearest town with no roads going in. Just old mining trails and footpaths that wind through some of the most beautiful and dangerous country on the East Coast. Deep gorges, rushing rivers, and rock formations that can kill you if you're not careful. It's the kind of place where one wrong step means nobody finds your body until spring. The area has always had a dark history. Mining accidents in the 1800s killed dozens of men, and there have been unexplained disappearances going back generations. Local folks whisper stories about things that live in the deep hollows, but I never paid much attention to mountain superstitions. My job was keeping people safe, not chasing ghost stories. November of 1984 started out like any other. Early snow had already dusted the peaks, and we were getting those freezing rainstorms that make the rocks slick as glass. I was doing my usual patrol of the backcountry when the call came in on my radio. "Dan, we've got a situation," crackled the voice of my supervisor, Tom McNeil. 3 hikers reported something strange near the Cranberry River Gorge. They claimed they saw a winged creature carrying people across the canyon. I keyed my radio and sighed. "Tom, it's probably just turkey vultures. They get pretty big, and in low light, these folks aren't first-time hikers, Dan. They know the difference between a bird and what they saw. Said it was huge, walking upright, and it was definitely carrying something human-sized." I grabbed my pack and headed toward the gorge, figuring I'd find some scattered camping gear and nervous hikers who'd spooked themselves with shadows. The trail down to the river was treacherous that time of year, with ice forming in, the shaded spots and loose rocks hidden under wet leaves. I'd made this hike hundreds of times, but something felt different that day. The forest was too quiet. Even with the early winter weather, there should have been some bird calls, some rustling in the underbrush. Instead, there was just the sound of my boots crunching through the frost and the distant rush of the river below. The hair on the back of my neck started to prickle, but I told myself it was just the cold. When I reached the gorge, I found the 3 hikers huddled around a small camp stove, their faces pale and eyes wide. They were experienced backpackers. I could tell from their gear and the way they'd set up their campsite. These weren't the type to panic over a curious bear or a low-flying owl. "Ranger Kirkpatrick?" One of them called out as I approached. "Thank God you're here. We need to report what we saw." The woman who spoke was maybe 40, with the lean build and steady gaze of someone who'd spent serious time in the wilderness. Her companions, 2 men about the same age, nodded grimly. "Tell me what happened," I said, pulling out my notebook. "We were setting up camp around 6 o'clock when we heard this sound," she began. "Like wings, but massive ones. Leathery, not feathers. We looked up and saw this thing flying across the gorge. It was carrying something," one of the men added, "something that looked human-shaped, just clutched in its claws like a doll." I scribbled notes, keeping my expression neutral. "How far away were you? What were the lighting conditions?" "Maybe 100 yards, the woman replied. "Still had good light, though the shadows were getting long. This wasn't a bird, Ranger. It was at least 8 feet tall with wings that had to span 15 feet easy." I asked a few more questions, took down their contact information, and assured them I'd investigate. They packed up and hiked out that evening, clearly eager to get away from the gorge. I radioed Tom and told him I'd found nothing conclusive, just some spooked hikers who'd probably seen a large bird in poor lighting. But that night, as I made camp near the river, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of massive wings beating overhead, so low I could feel the air pressure change. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the canopy, but saw nothing except dark branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was just a great horned owl hunting late, but deep down, something had changed. The mountains I'd called home for 13 years suddenly felt like they were watching me. 3 days later, Tom sent me back to the gorge with Rangers Mike Foster and Lisa Garrett. 2 more groups of hikers had reported sightings, and now we had our first missing person report. A solo hiker named David Chen had failed to check in at the ranger station as planned. Mike was a good kid, maybe 25, with 5 years of experience and enough sense to follow orders. Lisa had been with the service for 8 years and knew these mountains almost as well as I did. If anyone could help me figure out what was happening, it would be them. We started our search at Chen's last known position, a campsite about 2 miles upstream from where the hikers had reported their sighting. What we found there made no sense at all. Chen's backpack was hanging from a tree branch 30 feet off the ground. Not thrown there, hung there, as if someone had carefully placed it on the limb. His sleeping bag was spread out normally, his camp stove was set up for dinner, but there was no sign of Chen anywhere. How does a backpack end up that high? Mike asked, craning his neck to look up at it. I studied the tree carefully. No claw marks on the bark, no broken branches that would suggest someone had climbed up. Lisa, radio for climbing gear. We need to get that pack down. While we waited for equipment, we expanded our search. That's when we found the first nest. It was built into a rocky outcrop about 50 yards from Chen's campsite, maybe 20 feet above the ground. From a distance, it looked like a normal eagle's nest, just bigger. But when I got my binoculars on it, my hands started shaking. The nest was full of human belongings: watches, jewelry, bits of clothing, camping gear, all arranged in neat patterns like some kind of bizarre collection. And scattered throughout were bones, lots of them, bleached white and clean. Jesus Christ, Lisa whispered when I handed her the binoculars. What kind of animal does that? I'd seen plenty of strange animal behavior in my years as a ranger, but nothing like this. Bears might raid campsites, but they didn't build nests and arrange human belongings like trophies. Eagles didn't collect jewelry and camping equipment. We need to call this in, Mike said, his voice tight with worry. But before I could reach for my radio, we heard it, the sound of massive wings beating somewhere above the forest canopy. All 3 of us looked up, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Then Lisa screamed. A shadow passed over us, so large it blocked out the late afternoon sun for several seconds. The shadow moved wrong, not like a bird or aircraft, but like something that shouldn't be able to fly at all. When the shadow passed, my radio crackled with static. Mike's GPS unit started beeping error messages. Lisa's flashlight flickered and went out, even though she'd put fresh batteries in that morning. What the hell was that? Mike demanded, his voice cracking. I didn't have an answer. 13 years in these mountains, and I'd never seen anything that could cast a shadow that size. The biggest birds in West Virginia were turkey vultures, and their wingspan topped out around 6 feet. This shadow had to be 3 times that size. We used climbing gear to retrieve Chen's backpack, but found nothing inside that. Explained how it had gotten so high in the tree. His wallet was there, his food, his extra clothes, everything a hiker would need. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage to the pack itself. As we made our way back toward the ranger station, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few minutes, one of us would spin around, certain we'd heard footsteps or seen movement in the trees. But there was never anything there. That night, we camped together instead of splitting up like we normally would. None of us wanted to be alone in those woods after what we'd seen. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sound I'll never forget, a low, mournful call that echoed through the gorge like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. It was the sound of something that was profoundly, impossibly wrong. Mike sat up in his sleeping bag, eyes wide. Did you hear that? Before I could answer, Lisa grabbed my arm. Look up, she whispered. High above the gorge, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Something was flying back and forth in a deliberate pattern, something with wings that seemed to span the entire width of the canyon. As we watched, frozen with terror, the thing let out another one of those awful calls. Then it dove. Not toward us, but toward something on the far side of the gorge. We heard a brief, cut-off scream that sounded human, followed by the heavy beat of wings growing fainter as whatever it was flew deeper into the wilderness. I keyed my radio, but got nothing but static. The thing was jamming our communications somehow, cutting us off from the outside world. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I knew we couldn't just run. Someone, or something, was out there killing people, and we were the only ones who could stop it. The problem was, I had no idea what we were dealing with. As dawn broke over the gorge, we found fresh evidence of the night's horror. On the far side of the canyon, another campsite had been destroyed. Gear scattered everywhere, a tent shredded like paper, and another set of human belongings added to the growing collection in the impossible nest. But no body. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just killing people, it was taking them somewhere. Tom sent in 2 more rangers and a state police officer when we failed to check in the next morning. Our radios had been dead for almost 12 hours, and the backup communication system wasn't working either. Something about the gorge was creating a dead zone that cut us off from the outside world. The new arrivals were Rangers Bill Martinez and Sarah Kim, along with Trooper James Wright, all experienced outdoors people, all skeptical of our reports until we showed them the evidence. "I've been tracking poachers for 15 years, Martinez said, studying the nest through binoculars. "Never seen anything like this. What kind of animal builds nests this high and collects human belongings?" Wright was examining claw marks we'd found in the soft earth near Chen's campsite. "These tracks are over 1 foot long," he said. "Deep, too. Whatever made them has to weigh at least 300 pounds. The tracks were unlike anything in any field guide. 3 long talons in front, 1 shorter, 1 in back, like a bird of prey but scaled up to impossible size. The stride length suggested something that could walk upright when it chose to. That's when Sarah found the bone bridge. She'd been exploring a narrow section of the gorge, looking for alternate routes, when she called out for the rest of us to come see what she'd discovered. We rappelled down about 40 feet to a natural ledge that overlooked the rushing river below. Spanning the narrowest part of the gorge was a structure that made my blood freeze. Human bones, dozens of them, had been carefully woven together with sinew and plant material to create a bridge across the canyon. Arm bones formed the main supports, leg bones created cross braces, and skulls marked regular intervals like grotesque mile markers. "This isn't possible," Wright whispered. "Animals don't build structures like this." But it wasn't just a bridge. It was a work of art, created with intelligence and purpose that no animal possessed. The engineering was sound. The bridge could easily support the weight of a large creature. And it was recent construction. Some of the bones still had bits of dried tissue clinging to them. "How many people would it take to build something like this?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. I did a rough count. 15, maybe 20 victims. Based on the condition of the bones, this has been going on for months. That's when we realized we weren't dealing with a random killer. This thing, whatever it was, had been systematically hunting people in the wilderness, collecting their bones for this impossible construction project. And we were probably next on its list. As if summoned by our discovery, we heard the wing beats again. Closer this time, and more deliberate. The sound echoed off the canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Everyone stay together," I ordered, but it was too late. The attack came from above without warning. Sarah screamed as massive talons wrapped around her shoulders, lifting her off the ledge like she weighed nothing. I caught a glimpse of leathery wings, glowing red eyes, and a humanoid shape that was definitely not natural. "Shoot it!" Wright yelled, drawing his service weapon. But the thing was already gone, carrying Sarah across the gorge and up into the forest canopy. Her screams echoed for what felt like forever before cutting off abruptly. Martinez was on his radio, trying to call for backup, but getting nothing but static. "We're completely cut off," he reported. "Whatever this thing is, it's jamming all our duffet, the communications." That night, we made camp in a defensive position, with our backs to a rock wall and clear sight lines in all directions. Nobody slept. We took turns on watch, keeping our flashlights and weapons ready, but the thing didn't attack again. Instead, it tormented us. All night long, we heard Sarah's voice calling for help from somewhere across the gorge. Not screams of pain, but normal conversation, like she was just out of sight and trying to get our attention. "Help me find my pack," her voice would call. "I think I dropped it near the river." Or, "Hey guys, I found another way across. Come check this out." But it wasn't really Sarah. The voice was just slightly wrong, too flat, too emotionless. Like something was mimicking human speech without understanding what the words meant. "It's trying to lure us away from camp," Mike whispered. "Splitting us up." By dawn, we'd made a terrible discovery. Bill Martinez was gone. His sleeping bag was empty. His gear was still there, but Bill himself had vanished without making a sound. None of us had seen or heard anything during our watch shifts. "How is that possible?" Wright demanded. "We were watching all night. I checked the ground around our camp and found tracks. The same massive talons, but these led right through the middle of our defensive position. The thing had walked among us while we slept, somehow invisible or silent enough that none of us noticed. That's when I knew we were dealing with something far beyond normal predators. This wasn't just a large bird or mutated animal. It was intelligent, cunning, and possibly supernatural. And it was building something with human bones that required more victims to complete. With Bill Martinez missing and our communications still jammed, we had to make a choice. Abandon the search and try to hike out for help, or stay and face whatever was hunting us. Trooper Wright wanted to leave immediately, but I couldn't abandon. "Sarah and Bill, if there was any chance they were still alive. We need to find that thing's base of operations," I told the others. "If it's building bridges, it has to have a central location where it keeps its materials." Mike and Lisa agreed to help me search, but Wright decided to try hiking out alone to bring back reinforcements. We watched him disappear up the trail, hoping he'd make it to civilization before the creature found him. We never saw Wright again. Following the bone bridge across the gorge, we discovered a network of similar structures throughout the canyon system. Not just bridges, but platforms, walkways, and what looked like ritual sites. All built from human remains, all showing the same impossible engineering skill. The creature was building something massive, a complex that spanned miles of wilderness and required hundreds of victims to complete. But we still didn't understand why. That changed when we found the nest complex. Built into a series of caves high up on the canyon wall, the creature had created what could only be described as a workshop. Bones were sorted by type and size, arranged in neat piles like building materials. Skulls were lined up in rows, sorted by age and condition, and hanging from the ceiling were dozens of cocoons made from plant material and sinew. Some of the cocoons were moving. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered. "It's keeping them alive." I counted at least 20 cocoons, each one human-sized. As we watched in horror, we could see some of them breathing, shifting slightly as the people inside tried to move. That's when we heard Sarah's voice again, but this time it was coming from inside one of the cocoons. "Help me," she called weakly. "Please, I can't move. Something's wrapped around me." I started toward the cocoons, but Lisa grabbed my arm. "It could be a trap," she warned. She was right, but I couldn't just leave Sarah hanging there. Using my climbing knife, I carefully cut open the cocoon nearest to us. Sarah tumbled out, weak and disoriented but alive. "It's building something," she gasped as I helped her to her feet. "Some kind of gateway," it told me. It spoke to me in my dreams. "What kind of gateway?" I asked. "Between worlds?" Sarah said, her eyes wide with terror. "It's trying to bridge the gap between our reality and somewhere else. Somewhere dead. The bones aren't just building material, they're anchors. Each person it kills becomes part of the structure." That's when the creature appeared. It dropped from the cave ceiling without warning, landing between us and the exit. Standing upright, it was every bit as terrifying as the hikers had described. 8 feet tall, with leathery wings that scraped the cave walls when it spread them. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, and when it opened its mouth, we could see rows of sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh. But the worst part was its voice. When it spoke, it sounded almost human. "You should not have come here," it said, the words echoing strangely in the confined space. The bridge must be completed. Your bones will serve well. Mike raised his weapon, but the creature moved faster than anything that size should be able to. It knocked him down with one sweep of its wing, sending his gun clattering into the darkness. I reached for my own sidearm, but the thing was already in the air, talons extended toward my chest. At the last second, I dove sideways, rolling behind a pile of sorted bones. The bridge connects worlds. The creature continued, almost conversationally. Your realm has forgotten the old paths. I restore them, one bone at a time. Lisa helped Sarah to her feet, while I kept the creature distracted. Mike was unconscious, but breathing. We needed to get out of that cave, but the creature blocked the only exit. That's when I remembered my military training. The creature was intelligent, but it was also overconfident. It had been the apex predator in these mountains for so long that it didn't expect real resistance. I pulled the emergency flare from my survival kit and popped it. Brilliant red light filled the cave, and the creature shrieked in pain and anger. Its glowing eyes couldn't handle the sudden brightness, and it stumbled backward, momentarily blinded. "Run!" I yelled. Lisa and Sarah helped Mike to his feet, and we made a desperate dash for the cave entrance. The creature recovered quickly and came after us, but its massive wings made it clumsy in the confined space. We made it to the cave mouth just as the creature reached us. I felt its talons rake across my back, tearing through my jacket and drawing blood, but I managed to stay on my feet. That's when I did something crazy. Instead of running, I turned around and tackled the creature. We went down together in a tangle of wings and claws, rolling toward the edge of the ledge. The creature was stronger than me, but I had military hand-to-hand combat training and 13 years of wilderness survival experience. More importantly, I had something to fight for. As we struggled, the creature kept trying to get airborne, but I held on tight, using my rappelling gear to tangle its wings. If I could keep it grounded, maybe the others could escape. "Dan," Lisa called from somewhere behind me. "The bridge, it's collapsing." I looked across the gorge and saw that our struggle had somehow damaged the bone bridge. The carefully constructed framework was coming apart, human remains tumbling into the river below. The creature saw it too and let out a roar of rage that echoed through the canyon. "Years of work," it screamed. "Decades of collection." In its fury, it made a mistake. It released its grip on me and tried to fly toward the collapsing bridge. I used that moment to grab my emergency climbing anchor and drive the metal spike deep into the creature's left wing. It screamed again, this time in pain, and crashed back onto the ledge. Dark blood that smelled like sulfur poured from the wound. "You have destroyed nothing," it hissed at me. "The bridge can be rebuilt. There are always more bones." But even as it spoke, I could see it was weakening. The wing damage was severe, and the creature was bleeding heavily. It tried to attack me again, but its movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. That's when the cavalry arrived. A helicopter appeared over the gorge, searchlight blazing. The creature looked up in surprise and terror. It had probably never seen aircraft before. The pilot must have spotted us on the ledge because the chopper moved in closer, its rotor wash making it impossible for the creature to take flight. The Mothman, because that's what it was, I realized, looked at me with those terrible red eyes one last time. "This is not finished," it said. "The bridge must be built. The gateway must open." Then it leaped from the ledge and vanished into the darkness below. The official report blamed the deaths on a rogue black bear and unstable rock formations. The Cranberry River Gorge was closed to hikers indefinitely, with warnings about geological hazards and dangerous wildlife. Sarah, Mike, Lisa, and I were transferred to different parks, and we all signed non-disclosure agreements about what we'd seen. But I know the truth, and so do the other survivors. We rescued 12 people from those cocoons, including Bill Martinez. All of them were alive but traumatized, with gaps in their memory and stories about shared nightmares. The state provided counseling, but how do you explain to a therapist that you were being collected by a supernatural creature for use in an interdimensional construction project? Sarah left the Park Service entirely and moved to Florida. Mike transferred to a desk job in Richmond. Lisa stuck with ranger work but won't go anywhere near West Virginia. Bill took early retirement and hasn't left his house in 6 months. As for me, I developed a severe fear of flying. Not just in airplanes. I can't even watch birds anymore without breaking into a cold sweat. The sound of wings, any wings, sends me into a panic attack. I've tried therapy, medication, even hypnosis, but nothing helps. Some fears go too deep to cure. I still work in the mountains, but in Colorado now, far from the dark hollows of West Virginia. My new colleagues think I'm just another burned-out ranger with PTSD from a bear attack. They don't know that sometimes, on moonless nights, I still hear that awful call echoing across the peaks. The creature is still out there. I know because people still disappear in the cranberry wilderness. Hikers who ignore the closure warnings, researchers who don't believe in geological hazards, local kids who dare each other to explore the Forbidden Gorge. The official reports blame exposure, falls, and animal attacks, but the death numbers are wrong. Too many people, vanishing too regularly, all following the same pattern. It's rebuilding the bridge. The bone bridge I saw was just one part of a larger project. The creature, the Mothman, the Bone Bridge Collector, whatever you want to call it, is trying to create a permanent gateway between our world and something else. Something dead and hungry that wants to cross over. Every missing person provides more building material. Every unexplained disappearance brings it closer to completion. I've tried to warn people, but who's going to believe a story like that? Rangers are supposed to be rational, practical people who deal with facts, not folklore. When I mention supernatural predators and interdimensional bridges, people just nod politely and change the subject. So I'm telling you this story instead. If you're planning to hike in the mountains of West Virginia, especially around the cranberry wilderness, please be careful. Travel in groups, carry emergency beacons, and never camp alone. If you see large shadows moving overhead or hear massive wings beating in the darkness, don't investigate. Get out of there as fast as you can. And if you find bones arranged in patterns that don't look natural, or come across structures that seem too complex for animals to build, report it immediately. Don't try to be a hero. The creature is intelligent, powerful, and absolutely determined to complete its work. The bridge is still growing, one bone at a time. And someday, if we're not careful, it's going to finish what it started. When that happens, the mountains of West Virginia are going to become a gateway to somewhere humanity was never meant to go. And by then, it will be too late to stop it. I'm 51 years old now, and I've seen things that shouldn't exist in any rational world. I know most people will dismiss this as the ravings of a traumatized ranger with an overactive imagination. But if you're reading this, and you're planning to visit those mountains, please remember my warning. Some bridges are never meant to be crossed, and some collections should never be completed. My name is Patricia Blackstone, but everyone just calls me Patty. I've been a park ranger at Linville Gorge for 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. Before I put on this uniform, I spent 6 years as a professional rock climber. I've scaled cliffs all over the world, but there's something special about Linville Gorge. The Cherokee called it sacred ground, and I can see why. The quartzite walls rise 1,000 feet straight up from the river below, carved by millions of years of water and wind. Most folks call it the Grand Canyon of North Carolina, and they're not far off. I know every climbing route in this wilderness area. Table Rock, Hawksbill, the Chimneys. I've rescued people from all of them. 34 successful rescues in 8 years, and not one person died on my watch. I take pride in that number. When you're dealing with 1,000-foot drops and weather that can turn deadly in minutes, pride in your work isn't vanity, it's survival. September 1977 was shaping up to be a quiet month. The summer crowds had gone home, and we only had serious hikers and climbers left. That's how I like it. Fewer people means fewer rescues, and fewer rescues means I can focus on what really matters, keeping the wilderness safe and wild. I grew up in these mountains, listening to my grandmother's stories about spirits and haints that lived in the hollows. But I never put much stock in ghost stories. I'm a practical woman. When something goes wrong in the woods, there's usually a practical reason: bad weather, poor planning, or simple human error. I'd heard the Mexican kids at school tell stories about La Llorona, the weeping woman who drowned children. Scary campfire tales, nothing more. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in mid-September. I was checking permits at the Linville Falls parking area when a family approached my truck. Mom, dad, and 2 kids. A boy about 10 and a girl maybe 7. They looked shaken up. "Excuse me, Ranger," the father said. His name tag read, "Hello, my name is Bob from some conference. We camped near the river last night and we heard something strange." "What kind of strange?" I asked, pulling out my incident report pad. "You learn to take everything seriously in this job." "A woman crying," the mother said. She was holding her daughter's hand tight, all night long, like someone was in terrible pain. The little girl looked up at me with wide eyes. She was calling for her babies, she whispered. I heard her say Miss Niños over and over. My Spanish wasn't great, but I knew that meant my children. I felt a little chill run down my spine, but I pushed it away. Probably just another camper having a hard time. Divorces, deaths, all kinds of personal tragedy follow people into the woods. "Did you see anyone?" I asked. "That's the weird part," Bob said. "We looked everywhere with our flashlights. The crying seemed to come from right by the river, but there was nobody there. Sometimes sound carries funny in the gorge," I told them. "Echo can make voices seem closer than they are. Probably someone at a campsite upstream." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't right. I'd been working these woods for 8 years. I knew how sound traveled through the canyon, and I knew every permitted campsite for miles around. Nobody was supposed to be camping upstream from where this family had set up. After they left, I radioed my supervisor. "Hey Tom, I'm going to check on a possible unpermitted camper near Site 7. "Copy that, Patty. Weather Service says we might get storms this afternoon. Keep an eye on the sky." I hiked the 1.5 miles to the river, following the rough trail that wound between massive boulders and tall pines. The air was still and heavy, the way it gets before a storm. Even the birds seemed quiet. Site 7 was empty, just like it was supposed to be. I checked. The log, Flask campers had checked out 3 days ago. I walked upstream for another 1/2 mile, looking for any sign of people. Nothing. No fire rings, no trash, no trampled grass. But when I got to the bend in the river, where the family said they'd heard the crying, I found something that made me stop cold. Footprints in the mud, small, bare feet. A woman's feet, by the look of them. They came right to the water's edge, like someone had been standing there for a long time. But here's what made my skin crawl. The prints led straight into a solid rock wall. They just ended at the stone, like whoever made them had walked right through 20 feet of quartzite. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints. The rational part of my brain was working overtime. Maybe the rock had fallen after the person left. Maybe the water had been higher and covered a path. Maybe. But deep down, in the part of me that grew up hearing my grandmother's stories, I knew I was looking at something that couldn't be explained away. The first drops of rain started falling as I hiked back to my truck. By the time I reached the parking area, the storm was in full swing. Lightning cracked overhead, and the wind howled through the pines like something wild and angry. I should have known it was just the beginning. The call came in at 2:17 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my alarm clock, unable to sleep. The storm had passed, but something in the air still felt wrong. "Patty, we need you at the gorge. Emergency rescue." It was Tom's voice, tight with stress. "What's the situation?" "2 climbers. They were rappelling down the amphitheater when their ropes failed, both in the water." I was already pulling on my boots. "Ropes don't just fail, Tom. I know. That's what's got me worried." Carlos is already en route with the water rescue gear. Carlos Mendez was my partner for technical rescues. Good man, careful, climber. Never took unnecessary risks. If he was worried enough to break out the water gear in the middle of the night, this was serious. I made the drive to Linville in record time, my emergency lights cutting through the darkness. Carlos was already gearing up when I arrived, his face grim in the headlight beams. "What do we know?" I asked. "Jim and Sarah Peterson, experienced climbers from Asheville. They've been coming here for years. Jim called for help on his radio before." Carlos paused, before the screaming started. "Screaming? Listen for yourself." He handed me the radio and rewound the tape. Jim Peterson's voice came through clear at first. "This is Peterson to Linville Base. We have an equipment failure." Both our ropes snapped at the same time. That's impossible, but Sarah's in the water. The current's got her. Then came a sound that made my blood freeze. A woman's voice, crying and wailing, but not in English. It was Spanish, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. And underneath it all, Jim Peterson screaming for help. The transmission ended with a splash and static. How long ago? I asked. 47 minutes. We both knew what that meant. Water temperature in September was maybe 60 degrees. Even an experienced swimmer wouldn't last long. The hike down to the amphitheater normally took 30 minutes. We made it in 15, our headlamps cutting through the darkness between the massive rocks. The sound of rushing water grew louder as we descended. When we reached the river, Carlos swept his light across the surface. There, he said. Jim Peterson was clinging to a boulder in the middle of the current, about 50 feet downstream from where their ropes hung. He was conscious but barely moving. Hypothermia was setting in fast. "Jim," I called out. "Where's Sarah?" He turned his head toward us, and I could see the terror in his eyes. "She went under," he gasped. The woman in white. She pulled her down. Carlos and I exchanged glances. Hypothermia could cause hallucinations, but Jim Peterson was a veteran climber. He'd been in worse situations before. "We need to get him out first," Carlos said. Then we searched for Sarah. It took us 20 minutes to set up a rope system and haul Jim to shore. By the time we got him wrapped in emergency blankets, he was shaking so hard he could barely talk. "Tell me what happened," I said gently. We were halfway down when the ropes just snapped. Both at once. "That's impossible, Patty. These were new ropes, rated for 3,000 pounds. I checked them myself." "What about Sarah?" Jim's eyes went wide. "She hit the water first. I heard her calling for help, and then..." He stopped, struggling to get the words out. There was this other voice. A woman, crying like her heart was broken, and I saw her, pale dress, long black hair. She was reaching for Sarah. Hypothermia can cause... I know what I saw. Jim grabbed my arm. She wasn't human, Patty. The way she moved through the water, like it was air. And her eyes? He shuddered. Like moonlight on black water. We spent the next 3 hours searching for Sarah Peterson. We found her at dawn, caught in a tangle of roots near the old Cherokee prayer site 2 miles downstream. She'd been dead for hours. What bothered me wasn't just that we'd lost someone, though that was bad enough. It was the condition of those ropes. I examined them carefully while Carlos worked with the body recovery. Clean cuts, both of them, like they'd been sliced with a razor blade. But there were no sharp edges on the cliff face where they'd been rappelling. Nothing that could have cut through climbing rope like that. "Carlos," I called. "Come look at this." He walked over, keeping his voice low. "What is it?" "These ropes. They didn't fail from wear or stress. Someone cut them." "That's impossible. Jim and Sarah were alone out here." I held up the severed end of the rope. In the morning light, I could see something else that made my stomach turn. The fibers were wet, soaked through, even though the storm had ended hours before they started their climb. "Carlos, feel this." He touched the rope and jerked his hand back. "It's ice cold. And it smells like river water," I finished. We stood there in the growing daylight, 2 experienced rescue professionals trying to make sense of something that couldn't be explained. Jim Peterson was a reliable witness, and the evidence didn't lie. Something had been in that water with Sarah, something that could cut climbing ropes and move through rushing current like it was standing still. As we hiked back to the parking area with Sarah's body, I kept thinking about those footprints I'd found the day before. Bare feet leading into solid rock, and now wet ropes cut by something that couldn't have been there. I'd spent 8 years in these mountains, and I'd never lost anyone to something I couldn't understand. That record was broken now. And somehow, I knew Sarah Peterson wouldn't be the last. Word spread fast through the climbing community. By the end of the week, half our regular visitors had canceled their permits. The other half came anyway, armed with extra gear and grim determination. Climbers are a stubborn bunch. I should have turned them all away. The incidents started small. A family camping near the river reported their tent stakes pulled up in the night, their gear scattered toward the water. No animal tracks, no sign of human interference. Another group found their climbing ropes soaked through, even though they'd been stored in a dry pack. Each time, there were sounds, crying, calling, always in Spanish, always the same words. Mis niños, ¿dónde están mis niños? Tom assigned Carlos to work with me full-time on what he was calling the Linville situation. We didn't talk about it that way between ourselves. Carlos had grown up in New Mexico, and he knew the stories better than I did. My grandmother used to tell us about La Llorona, he said one afternoon as we hiked back from another incident report. The weeping woman who drowned her children and now searches for others to take their place. That's Mexican folklore, I said. We're in North Carolina. Folklore travels, Patty, and water spirits. They're not bound by borders. I wanted to argue, but the evidence was getting harder to ignore. 3 more climbing accidents in 5 days. Ropes failing, gear mysteriously waterlogged, and always that crying in the night. We hadn't lost anyone else yet, but it was only a matter of time. The breakthrough came when I was researching the local history. I'd driven into town to check the library archives, looking for anything about drowning incidents or unusual deaths near Linville Gorge. What I found made me understand why the Cherokee had considered this place sacred. In 1823, a flash flood had swept through the gorge during what should have been the dry season. 7 people died, including a Cherokee woman named Ayanna and her 3 children. According to the newspaper account, she'd been visiting from a reservation in Oklahoma, part of a group trying to return sacred items to their ancestral burial sites. The article said Ayanna's body was never found, but her children were discovered miles downstream. Witnesses reported hearing a woman crying and calling in Cherokee for days after the flood, but when search parties investigated, they found no one. More incidents had followed over the years. Always in September, always involving water, always preceded by the sound of a woman weeping. The last major incident had been in 1952, when 2 children from a camping family had wandered away in the night. They were found the next morning at the river's edge, unconscious but alive, with no memory of how they'd gotten there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those children from 1952 and about Sarah Peterson, and about the way Jim's ropes had been cut clean through. Something was hunting in my forest, and I was supposed to protect people from it. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and drove back to the gorge. I told myself I was just checking on things, making sure no campers had snuck in without permits. But really, I think I was hoping to find answers. The parking area was empty, but I could hear something as soon as I stepped out of my truck. Crying. Soft and heartbroken, drifting up from the direction of the river. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, then thought better of it. If this was what I thought it was, backup wouldn't help. I left the radio in the truck. The trail down to the water was treacherous in the dark, but I'd walked it 1,000 times. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness between the trees, and the sound of crying grew closer. I was definitely Spanish now, and I could make out the words clearly. Mis niños, ¿dónde están mis niños? I reached the river bend where I'd found those first footprints. In my flashlight beam, I could see fresh ones now, small, bare feet, and this time I could see where they came from. She was standing in the middle of the river. The woman was exactly as Jim Peterson had described her. Pale dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. Long black hair streaming with water, and eyes that reflected my flashlight like an animal's. She was waist-deep in current that should have swept her away, but she stood perfectly still. When she saw my light, she turned toward me. Her face was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like looking at grief itself, given human form. Water streamed from her hair and dress, pooling at her feet even though she was standing in the river. Mis niños, she said, and her voice carried clearly over the sound of rushing water. Have you seen my children? Every instinct told me to run. But I was a park ranger, and this was my territory. There are no children here, I said. This is wilderness area. Families camp upstream. She smiled, and it was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. Niños come to the water. Always, they come to the water. That's when I realized what she meant. Children were drawn to rivers and streams. It was natural, and camping families always set up near water sources. She was hunting. You can't have them, I said. The smile disappeared. The temperature around me dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and frost began forming on the rocks at my feet. The river started to rise, water lapping higher on the banks, even though there'd been no rain for days. "I lost my babies," she said, and her voice echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. "The water took them. Now I take others." The current reached my boots. In seconds, it was up to my ankles, then my knees. The river was flooding, defying every law of nature I understood. I tried to back away, but my feet were stuck. The water held me like cement, and it was getting deeper. Soon, it would be over my head. "Please," the woman said, reaching toward me. "Come to the water. Help me find my children." Her fingers were inches from my face when I heard a voice shouting from the trail above. "Patty, where are you?" "Carlos." He must have seen my truck and come looking. The woman's attention shifted toward the sound, and her grip on the water loosened just enough. I broke free and scrambled up the muddy bank, gasping and shaking. "Here," I called. "Carlos, stay away from the river." By the time he reached me, the water had receded to normal levels. The woman was gone, but I could still hear her crying, fainter now, drifting downstream toward the camping areas. "What happened?" Carlos helped me to my feet. "You're soaked." "We have a problem," I said. "A big one, and we need to warn everyone to stay away from the water." But even as I said it, I knew it was too late. Somewhere in the darkness, a family was sleeping in their tent by the river, and their children were dreaming peaceful dreams. She was coming for them next. We didn't make it in time. Carlos and I ran through the forest, following the sound of crying as it moved downstream toward the permitted camping areas. My radio crackled with static every time I tried to call for backup. The presence of that thing was interfering with electronics. When we reached campsite 12, we found the tent empty. Sleeping bags were still warm, parents' gear scattered around, but no sign of the family. Fresh footprints in the mud led toward the water, 2 adults running, and something else that made my heart stop. Tiny bare feet. A child's prints, walking calmly alongside the impossible tracks of the woman in white. "The water," Carlos said grimly. "She's taken someone to the water." We followed the trail, down to a bend in the river where the current formed a deep pool. That's where we found them. Bill and Janet Morrison from Charlotte, standing waist-deep in the dark water, their eyes blank and staring. Between them was their 7-year-old daughter, Lucy, holding the hand of something that shouldn't exist. The woman in white was clearer now, more solid. In the moonlight, I could see she was beautiful, in a terrible way. Her dress moved with its own current, and water flowed from her hair like a waterfall. She was singing softly in a mix of Spanish and Cherokee, a lullaby that made the air itself feel heavy and wrong. "Ven conmigo, pequeña," she crooned to Lucy. "Come with me, little one. We'll find my babies together." The Morrison parents stood like statues, caught in whatever spell held them. But Lucy was fighting it. I could see the confusion in her face, the fear breaking through the hypnotic pull. "Lucy," I called out. "Lucy, look at me." The little girl's head turned slightly, and for a moment her eyes cleared. "Ranger Patty, I can't move my feet. The water won't let me." The woman in white hissed like steam escaping a kettle. "She is mine now. They are all mine. I will have my children back." "Your children are dead," I said, stepping carefully into the shallows. The water was ice cold and felt thick as syrup. "They've been dead for over 100 years. "No!" Her scream shattered the quiet of the forest. Birds exploded from trees, and the river began to churn. "They live. They wait for me. These niños will bring them home." That's when I understood. She wasn't just taking children. She was trying to trade them. In her broken mind, if she brought enough souls to the water, somehow her own babies would be returned to her. The water rose higher, reaching Lucy's chest. The little girl was starting to panic, struggling against the supernatural current that held her family in place. "Carlos," I said quietly, "my grandmother used to tell stories about water spirits. How do you stop them? In New Mexico, we use salt and prayers. But this isn't just La Llorona, Patty. She's mixed with something else. Something from this land. Cherokee burial ground. Sacred water. A mother's grief strong enough to bind her spirit to this place for over a century and a half." "The Cherokee," I said. "We need Cherokee prayers." But we didn't have time to find a tribal elder. The water was up to Lucy's neck now, and her parents were sinking deeper. I could see the woman in white preparing to pull them all under. Then I remembered something from my research. The newspaper article about the 1823 flood had mentioned sacred items. Ayana had been returning them to burial sites when the flood took her family. "You came here to honor the dead," I called out to her. "Your people, your ancestors. You were doing something sacred when the water took your children." She paused, her terrible eyes focusing on me. I was bringing home the bones of my grandmother. The water spirits were angry. They took my babies as payment. Then you know the old ways. You know the proper ceremonies. "I know only grief," she whispered. "I know only the crying that never ends." I waded deeper into the supernatural current, feeling it pull at my legs like quicksand. "Teach me the ceremony. Help me honor your children properly, and let these people go." For a moment, the river went still. The woman in white stared at me with eyes that held a century of sorrow. "You would do this? You would speak for my babies?" "Yes." Carlos was beside me now, his voice low and urgent. "Patty, what are you doing?" "What I should have done from the beginning," I said. "My job is to protect this wilderness and the people in it. All the people." The woman in white released Lucy's hand. The little girl gasped and stumbled toward shore, followed by her parents as the spell broke. But the water around me grew colder, and I could feel something vast and ancient stirring in the depths. "The ceremony requires a life," she said sadly. "A mother's life for a mother's children. That is the price the water spirits demand." "Then take mine." "No." Carlos lunged forward, but the current knocked him back. The woman in white reached for me, her fingers passing through my flesh like ice water. For a moment, I felt her grief as if it were my own. The overwhelming loss, the endless searching, the hope that somewhere in the darkness her children were waiting. But I also felt something else. Peace. For the first time in over a century, Ayana's spirit touched something beyond sorrow. "You have no children," she said wonderingly. "Yet you would die for these." "It's what we do," I said. "We protect the ones who can't protect themselves." She smiled then, and it was beautiful instead of terrible. "My children, they are not lost. They wait for me in the place beyond water, beyond tears. I have been looking in the wrong direction." The water began to recede. The woman in white grew translucent, fading like mist in the morning sun. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for reminding me how to let go." And then she was gone, taking the unnatural cold with her. The river returned to its normal flow, and somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard the laughter of children at play. The official report listed the Morrison family incident as a case of sleepwalking triggered by altitude and stress. The climbing accidents were attributed to equipment failure and poor weather conditions. Sometimes the truth isn't what people need to hear. Tom transferred me to a desk job for 2 weeks while I recovered from the stress of multiple rescue operations. I spent the time researching Cherokee water ceremonies and visiting with Mary Owl, an elder from the Eastern Band who helped me understand what had really happened at Linville Gorge. "Grief can bind a spirit to this world," she told me over coffee in her kitchen. "But only love can set it free. You showed Ayana that her children were safe, that she could stop searching. Will she come back?" "No, her journey is finished. But," Mary paused, studying my face, "you've been marked by the experience. The water spirits know you now. They may call on you again." I returned to active duty in October, and everything seemed normal for a while. The climbing accidents stopped. No more reports of crying in the night. Families camped by the river without incident. But I was different. I could feel it in the way the forest spoke to me now, in the way water moved differently when I was near. I'd touched something ancient and powerful, and it had left its mark. 3 months later, I got a call from a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains. "Patty, I heard you handled some unusual incidents at Linville. We've got something similar here. Missing hikers, strange sounds, equipment failures near water. Could you come take a look?" I packed my gear that same afternoon. The thing about supernatural encounters is that they change how you see the world. Every forest has its spirits, every river its secrets. Most of the time, they sleep quietly, content to let the living world go about its business. But sometimes grief or anger or ancient promises wake them up. That's when they call rangers like me. I still work the high country, still make my rescues and file my reports. But I also listen for the sounds that don't belong, watch for the signs that something old is stirring. I've learned Cherokee water blessings and Spanish prayers for the dead. I carry salt in my pack and sage in my pocket. And sometimes, on quiet September nights when the moon is dark and the mist rises from the gorge, I can still hear her. Not crying anymore, but singing. Lullabies in Cherokee and Spanish, drifting on the wind like a mother's love that has finally found its way home. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also keep their promises. Ayanna found her peace, and her children found their rest. As for me, I found my true calling. Some people protect the wilderness from the living. I protect the living from what lurks in the wilderness. And sometimes, if I'm very lucky, I help lost souls find their way to whatever comes after the crying stops. The water spirits remember, and they know where to find me when they need someone who understands that love is stronger than grief, and that sometimes the best way to protect people is to help the dead find peace. That's the real job of a ranger in these mountains. We guard the boundary between what is and what should no longer be. And we make sure that when the old sorrows wake up, they remember how to sleep again. My name is Michael Stormcrow, and I've been a park ranger on Grandfather Mountain for 19 years. 19 winters above the tree line, 47 major storms, and more rescues than I care to count. When people ask me why I chose the highest, coldest, most dangerous posting in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I tell them it's because someone has to do it. But the truth is simpler than that this mountain chose me. My Cherokee grandmother used to say, Grandfather Mountain was sacred, a place where the spirit world touched ours. She'd tell stories about creatures that walked between worlds, things that hunted in the deep cold. I loved those stories as a kid, but as a grown man with a meteorology degree and 2 decades of mountain experience, I knew better. Wendigos belonged in Canadian folklore, not North Carolina. The only monsters on my mountain were hypothermia, altitude sickness, and people who didn't respect the weather. December 1989 was shaping up to be one of the worst winters on record. The weather station at the summit had been recording temperatures 20 degrees below normal for 3 straight weeks. Ice storms kept rolling through, coating everything in a shell of frozen death. Most years, we'd close the high trails after Thanksgiving, but this year we'd shut down everything above 4,000 feet by Halloween. That's why I was surprised when my radio crackled to life on December 15th with an emergency call. Ranger Station, this is Duke University Research Team 7, the voice said, cutting through static. We have a situation at the weather station. 4 team members missing, equipment destroyed. Request immediate assistance. I grabbed the radio. Research Team 7, this is Ranger Stormcrow. What's your current location? Summit Weather Station. We've been here since Monday, conducting cold weather gear tests. Yesterday, our team went out to check instruments and never came back. This morning, we found... Jesus, you need to. See this. The line went quiet except for wind howling in the background. Team 7, what exactly did you find? The weather shack is torn apart from the inside. Equipment scattered everywhere. And there's blood. Lots of blood, but no bodies. I looked out my window at the ice-covered peaks, disappearing into gray clouds. The weather service was calling for another storm system to move in by evening. Temperature was supposed to drop to 15 below deadly cold, even for experienced climbers. Team 7, how many people do you have at your location? 3 of us left, Dr. Sarah Martinez, Tom Chen, and myself, Dr. Kevin Walsh. We're in the main research building, but something's been circling us all night. We can hear it walking around outside, making sounds like it's talking to itself. I'd been on enough mountain rescues to know when people were starting to panic. Altitude, cold, and isolation could make anyone imagine things. But the destroyed equipment and missing people were real problems that needed real solutions. Sit tight, Team 7. I'm coming up with a rescue team. Stay inside, keep warm, and don't go out for any reason. I'll be there in 4 hours. Hurry, Walsh's voice cracked. Whatever killed our people, I don't think it's done. I clicked off the radio and started gathering gear. High-altitude winter rescue was dangerous enough without adding paranoid researchers to the mix. But as I loaded my pack with emergency flares, medical supplies, and cold weather gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this whole situation. The temperature readings on my instruments showed the summit was already at -5, with winds gusting to 60 miles per hour. Normal protocol said to wait for better weather, but 4 missing people meant we couldn't wait. I called for backup. Rangers Tom Bradley and Jennifer Walsh would meet me at the base camp with snowmobiles and rescue equipment. As I drove up the winding mountain road, I thought about my grandmother's stories. She'd always said the mountain had moods, that it could turn angry when disturbed. Looking at the ice-covered trees bending in the wind, I almost believed her. But I was a park ranger, not a storyteller. My job was to save lives, not chase shadows. I had no idea that by morning, I'd be the one running for my life. The snowmobiles could only take us to about 4,800 feet before the trail became too steep and icy. From there, we'd have to climb the last 1,000 feet on foot, carrying full rescue packs in conditions that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. Tom Bradley had been my partner for 8 years. He was built like a bear and twice as tough, with a beard that collected icicles and a laugh that could be heard over avalanches. Jennifer Walsh was newer to the team, but had proven herself on a dozen difficult rescues. She moved through snow like she was born to it, and her medical training had saved more lives than anyone kept track of. "Hell of a day for a house call," Tom said as we strapped on crampons and checked our gear one last time. The wind was getting stronger, and snow was starting to fall in thick, wet flakes that stuck to everything. "Research team's been up there since Monday," I told them. 4 missing, 3 survivors holed up in the station. They mentioned destroyed equipment and blood, but no bodies. Jennifer frowned. "That's strange. If someone was injured badly enough to leave that much blood, they wouldn't get far in this weather. We should find them between here and the summit." We started climbing. The trail zigzagged up the exposed face of the mountain, switching back and forth across granite ledges that had been carved by wind and ice over thousands of years. Even with headlamps, visibility was maybe 10 feet in any direction. The snow was coming down harder now, and the wind kept trying to push us off the narrow path. About halfway up, Tom stopped and pointed his light at something in the snow. "Mike, you need to see this." I worked my way over to where he was standing and looked down. There in the snow was a footprint, but it was wrong. Too big, for one thing. Maybe 14 inches long and shaped like a human foot, but stretched out, with toe marks that looked more like claws. The weird part was how deep it was pressed into the ice. Whatever made it had to weigh at least 300 pounds. "Could be a bear print that got distorted by wind," Jennifer suggested. But she didn't sound convinced. I knelt down and looked closer. Bears didn't walk upright in blizzards, and they sure didn't leave prints this clear in ice-hard snow. More importantly, the print was fresh made within the last few hours. "We stay together from here on," I said. "Whatever made this, it's still around." The higher we climbed, the worse the weather got. My thermometer was reading -12, and the Saint-Bess wind chill had to be pushing -30. Ice was forming on the inside of my goggles, and I could feel the cold trying to creep through every gap in my gear. That's when we found the first body. It was Tom Chen, one of the missing researchers. He was about 100 feet off the main trail, sitting upright against a boulder like he'd stopped to rest. But when Jennifer checked him with her light, we saw the truth. "Jesus Christ," Tom Bradley whispered. Something had torn Chen apart. His winter gear was shredded, and there were massive claw marks across his chest and arms. But the worst part was his face. It was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, eyes wide open, mouth stretched in a scream that the wind had swallowed. "What could do this?" Jennifer asked. But I was already looking around for tracks. I found them. The same oversized footprints, but this time there were more of them. Circling the body like whatever killed Chen had danced around him first. The prints led away from the trail and up toward the summit, following a path no human could climb in this weather. "We need to get to those survivors," I said. "Now." The weather station sat on a flat area just below the summit, a cluster of small buildings connected by guide ropes to keep people from getting lost in whiteout conditions. As we approached, I could see that one of the structures the equipment shed had been completely destroyed. The walls were caved in from the inside, like something had exploded outward with incredible force. The main building was still intact, with warm light glowing from the windows. I knocked on the door and called out, "Park Service, we're here to help." The door opened immediately, and Dr. Kevin Walsh pulled us inside. He was a thin man in his 30s, but he looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past few days. His hands were shaking, and his eyes kept darting to the windows. "Thank God you're here," he said. "It's been circling the building all night. We can hear it scratching at the walls, trying to find a way in." Inside, the other two survivors, Dr. Sarah Martinez and a graduate student named Mike Peters, were huddled around a propane heater. Martinez was bandaging a nasty cut on Peters' arm, and both of them looked like they hadn't slept in days. "Tell me what happened," I said, setting down my pack and accepting a cup of hot coffee that Walsh offered. "We came up Monday to test some new cold weather equipment," Martinez explained. "Everything was normal until Wednesday night. That's when the temperature started dropping faster than our instruments could track. We're talking about a 40-degree drop in 6 hours that's meteorologically impossible." "Where are your missing team members?" Jennifer asked. "Tom went out Thursday morning to check the instruments and never came back. We found him this afternoon, about a quarter-mile down the trail." Walsh's voice dropped to a whisper. Something had eaten parts of him. I thought about the body we'd found, remembering the claw marks and that frozen scream. "What about the other three?" "Lisa and David went looking for Tom Thursday evening. We heard them screaming around midnight, but by the time we got our gear on to go help them, the screaming had stopped. We found Lisa's backpack this morning, but it was empty and covered in blood." Peter spoke up for the first time, his voice barely audible over the wind. "There's something else. The equipment shed didn't just fall down. Something broke out of it from the inside. We found footprints leading away, but they weren't human prints. That's when the lights went out. The building was plunged into absolute darkness, except for the glow from the propane heater. Outside, the wind suddenly stopped, leaving an unnatural silence that was somehow more terrifying than all the noise. Then we heard it walking around the building. Slow, deliberate, footsteps crunching through the snow. But the steps were too far apart, like whatever was making them had legs twice as long as they should be. "Nobody move," I whispered, but my hand was already reaching for the emergency flare in my belt. The footsteps stopped right outside the main window. Through the darkness, I could see a shape pressed against the glass, tall, impossibly thin, with eyes that reflected the heater's glow like an animal's. It was looking right at me, and then it smiled, showing teeth that were too long and too sharp to belong to anything human. The thing outside the window didn't move for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. It just stood there, studying us like we were specimens in a jar. In the dim light from the propane heater, I could make out more details that made my blood run cold. It had to be 9 feet tall, with arms that hung down past where its knees should be. Its skin looked gray and mottled, like old ice, and steam that was rising from its body, even though the temperature outside was deadly cold. But the worst part was how human it looked, like someone had taken a person and stretched them out, making everything too long and too sharp. Jennifer was reaching slowly for her radio when the creature suddenly moved. Not toward us, but away, disappearing from the window so quickly it might have been a trick of the light. "What the hell was that?" Peters whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard metal tearing. The creature was on the roof, ripping off the weather vane and some kind of antenna. Pieces of equipment crashed down past the windows, and the sound of claws scraping against metal filled the air. "It's trying to cut off our communications," Tom Bradley said, grabbing his rifle from his pack. The scratching stopped. Then we heard footsteps again, but this time they were moving around the entire building, circling us. The thing was checking for weaknesses, looking for a way in. "We need to get out of here," Walsh said. "Whatever that is, it's not going to give up." I was thinking the same thing, but looking outside at the blizzard that was getting worse by the minute, I knew we'd never make it down the mountain in these conditions. The temperature had dropped to -15, and the wind was gusting strong enough to knock a person off their feet. That's when the creature started talking. It wasn't human speech, but it wasn't animal sounds either. It was like someone whispering in a language I'd never heard, but somehow I understood the meaning. It was hungry. It had been hungry for a long time, and now it had found food. "Oh God," Martinez whispered. "It's learning our language. It's been listening to us." The whispering got louder, and I realized the creature was speaking words now broken. distorted English that sounded like it was coming from a throat that wasn't designed for human speech. Cold. So cold. Need warmth. Need flesh. Peter started hyperventilating. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. I grabbed him by the shoulders. Listen to me. We're going to get through this, but I need everyone to stay calm. Tom, Jennifer, check all the windows and doors. Make sure everything's locked tight. As they moved around the building, I tried to make sense of what we were dealing with. My grandmother's stories came flooding back, tales of creatures that lived in the deep cold. Things that had once been human, but had turned into something else out of hunger and desperation. Wendigo, I said without thinking. Walsh looked at me like I'd lost my mind. What? Cherokee folklore. Creatures that eat human flesh and grow stronger from it. They're supposed to live in the far north, but if the climate's changing. You're talking about fairy tales, Martinez said. There has to be a scientific explanation. The building shook as something heavy slammed into the side wall. Then again, the creature was testing the structure, seeing how much force it would take to break in. Scientific explanation or not, we need weapons, Tom Bradley said, checking his rifle. I've got a .30-06 and about 20 rounds. What else do we have? I took inventory. Emergency flares, a hatchet, a couple of knives, and some basic mountaineering gear. Not much against something that could tear apart a reinforced weather station. The attacks on the wall stopped, and we heard the creature moving again. This time, it was heading for the back of the building, where the emergency generator was housed in a small shed. It's going after our power, Jennifer realized. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the generator coughed and died. The electric heater shut off, leaving us with just the propane unit and our body heat to keep warm. At these temperatures, we'd start getting hypothermia within a couple of hours. Smart, I said. It's not just hunting us, it's wearing us down. That's when we heard Jennifer scream. She was at the back window, shining her flashlight outside. In the beam, we could see the creature dragging something through the snow. It was David Chen, one of the missing researchers. He was still alive, trying to crawl away, but the creature had him by the leg and was pulling him toward the tree line. Tom raised his rifle and aimed through the window, but I pushed the barrel down. You'll hit David, I said. David's already dead, Tom replied grimly. We need to save ammunition for when it comes for us. He was right, but watching that poor guy get dragged into the darkness was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do. His screams lasted about 30 seconds before the wind swallowed them. The creature came back an hour later. This time it brought friends. We could see them moving around the building, tall, gaunt shapes that seemed to flow through the snow like ghosts. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more. They were communicating with those same whispered words, planning something. How many people have gone missing on this mountain over the years? Martinez asked. I thought about it. Hikers, climbers, research teams. Maybe a dozen people in the past 5 years, all during winter storms. We'd always assumed they'd fallen into crevices or died of exposure, but now, they're not just killing people, I realized. They're making more of themselves. The attacks started in earnest just after midnight. The creatures took turns slamming into the walls, each impact shaking the entire building. They were trying to collapse the structure, and it was working. Cracks appeared in the walls, and snow started blowing in through gaps around the windows. We can't stay here, Walsh said. This building won't last another hour. I looked outside at the storm. Visibility was 0. The wind was strong enough to knock down trees, and the temperature was still dropping. Going out there was suicide, but staying was death too. There's an old Cherokee fire ceremony, I said, thinking of my grandmother's teachings. It's supposed to keep evil spirits away. It might buy us some time. Tom looked at me like I'd suggested we all start speaking in tongues. Mike, this isn't the time for. A massive impact cut him off. One of the creatures had thrown itself against the main door hard enough to crack the frame. Wood splinters flew across the room, and we could see claws reaching through the gap, trying to get enough purchase to rip the door apart. Everyone to the back room, now, I shouted. As we retreated, I grabbed the emergency flares from my pack. If fire was the answer, I was going to give these things more fire than they could handle. The door finally gave way, just as we barricaded ourselves in the small storage room at the back of the building. Through the thin wall, we could hear the creatures moving around, destroying everything they could find. They were looking for us, But they were also doing something else, eating. I could hear them tearing into the food supplies, making satisfied grunting sounds as they fed. They're not just carnivores, I whispered to Jennifer. They eat everything when they're hungry enough. That's when I realized we had one advantage. These things had been starving in the cold for who knows how long. They were so focused on feeding that they might not notice us escaping through the back window. But first, I had to thin out their numbers. I pulled the pins on 2 emergency flares and tossed them into the main room. The brilliant red light exploded through the building, and the creatures shrieked a sound like metal being torn apart. They weren't just hurt by the light. They were terrified of it. "The window now!" I yelled. One by one, we squeezed through the small back window into the howling storm outside. The cold hit us like a physical blow, but we kept moving. Behind us, the creatures were still screaming, and I could smell smoke. The flares had set something on fire. We had maybe a 10-minute head start before they recovered and came after us. 10 minutes to get down a mountain in the worst blizzard I'd ever seen. It wasn't going to be enough. The storm was so bad we could barely see each other, even roped together. Snow was coming down in sheets, and the wind kept trying to push us off the narrow trail. But behind us, we could hear the creatures recovering from the flare attack. Their screams were getting closer. "The emergency shelter," Jennifer shouted over the wind. "There's a cave about half a mile down the north face. We can hole up there until the storm passes." I knew the place. She meant a natural granite overhang that the Park Service had reinforced with supplies for emergencies exactly like this. If we could reach it, we'd have some protection and maybe enough gear to last until morning. The problem was getting there alive. We'd made it about 200 yards down the trail when Tom Bradley stopped suddenly. "Something's wrong," he said. "Listen." I stopped and tried to hear over the wind. At first there was nothing, but then I caught it, the sound of the creatures moving through the snow. They were faster than us, and they were getting closer. But more importantly, they weren't just behind us anymore. They were on both sides of the trail, trying to cut off our escape route. "They're hurting us," I realized, "driving us towards something." That's when I saw it, a 4th creature waiting on the trail ahead, crouched low like a cat ready to pounce. It was bigger than the others, covered in ice that made it look like a living glacier. When it saw us, it stood up to its full height, which had to be at least 10 feet. "Back up slowly," I whispered. "Don't run." But Peters panicked. He turned and tried to bolt back up the trail, right into the arms of one of the Kumpir creatures that had been following us. The thing grabbed him by the head and lifted him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Tom raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots. The bullets hit the creature center mass, but they barely slowed it down. It looked at the wounds with something that might have been curiosity, then bit Peter's head clean off. That's when all hell broke loose. The creatures attacked from 3 directions at once. Tom kept firing, and Jennifer was swinging her ice axe at anything that got close. Walsh was screaming and trying to run, but there was nowhere to go. I grabbed the last of my emergency flares and started lighting them, throwing the burning red light in every direction. The creatures recoiled from the fire, giving us a few seconds to regroup. "The cave!" I yelled. "We have to reach the cave." We fought our way down the trail, step by bloody step. Tom ran out of ammunition and switched to his hatchet. Jennifer's medical training helped her target the creature's weak spots, joints, tendons, anything that would slow them down. But there were too many of them, and they were too strong. That's when the biggest creature spoke, in perfect English. "I remember you," it said, looking directly at me. "Your grandmother taught you the old ways. She tried to keep us away with her ceremonies." I stopped fighting for a second, stunned. "What?" "Sarah Bushyhead. She built fires on the sacred places, sang the protection songs. But the mountain changed. The cold came deeper. We had to come down. My grandmother. This thing knew my grandmother." "You're lying," I said. "She died trying to keep us in the high places. But the world grew warm, and we grew hungry. Now we take what we need." The creature that had been my grandmother, or what was left of her, reached out with claws that had once been human hands. I could see traces of the woman who had raised me in its face, distorted and stretched, but still recognizable. I lit my last flare and held it like a weapon. "I won't let you hurt anyone else. You cannot stop the hunger, grandson. Join us. Live forever in the cold." "Behind me," Tom screamed. One of the creatures had him by the arm and was dragging him toward the trees. Jennifer tried to help, but another creature knocked her down and started advancing on her with those terrible claws. I had one chance, one shot at saving what was left of my team. I threw the flare directly at the thing that had been my grandmother and ran for the cave. Not because I was abandoning my friends, but because I knew what was stored there. The emergency shelter had been built on an old Cherokee ceremonial site, and my grandmother had made sure certain protections were put in place. The cave was maybe 50 yards away, but it felt like 50 miles. I could hear the creatures following, and I could hear Tom's screams getting weaker. Jennifer was still fighting, but I knew she wouldn't last much longer. I reached the cave just as my strength gave out. Inside, covered by a tarp, was the emergency cache food, water, medical supplies, and something else. A metal box that my grandmother had given to the Park Service years ago, with instructions that it should only be opened in case of spiritual emergency. I tore open the box. Inside were cedar branches, sage, and a small pouch of sacred tobacco. Everything I needed for the protection ceremony my grandmother had taught me as a child. The creatures reached the mouth of the cave just as I got the fire started. The sacred smoke filled the small space, and suddenly the things that had been hunting us stopped dead. "You know the old ways," the creature that had been my grandmother said. Its voice was different now, sadder. "But it is too late. The hunger is too strong." "It's never too late," I said, feeding more cedar into the fire. "Grandmother, you taught me that the mountain protects those who respect it. Help me protect my friends." For a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in the creature's eyes, something human trying to break through the hunger and the cold. "The sacred fire," it whispered. "I remember the sacred fire." The creature took a step back from the cave entrance. Then another. The other creatures followed, retreating into the storm. But I knew this wasn't over. The fire would only hold them for so long, and Tom and Jennifer were still out there, if they were still alive. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and ran back into the storm. I found Jennifer first, unconscious but breathing, half buried in the snow about 30 feet from the cave. She had a deep gash across her forehead and what looked like claw marks on her arms. But she was alive. Tom was harder to find. I followed the blood trail into the trees, expecting the worst. What I found was Tom sitting propped up against a pine tree, holding his rifle and staring into the brief darkness. "Mike?" he said when he saw my light. "Is that really you?" "It's me. Are you hurt?" "Shoulders torn up pretty bad, and I think I've got a concussion. But I'm alive." He looked around nervously. "Where did they go?" "The sacred fire drove them back. But we need to get Jennifer to a hospital, and we need to get off this mountain before they come back." It took us 4 hours to make our way down to where we'd left the snowmobiles. Jennifer regained consciousness about halfway down, but she was in shock and couldn't remember much about what had happened. Tom was losing blood, and I was running on adrenaline and Cherokee prayers. We reached the base camp just as the sun was coming up. The storm was finally breaking, and I could see rescue helicopters in the distance, coming to airlift the injured to the hospital. Walsh and Martinez never made it off the mountain. Search teams found their remains 3 days later, along with the bodies of the original research team. The official report blamed animal attacks combined with severe weather exposure. The case was closed, but I knew the truth. I put in my transfer request the following week. Grandfather Mountain needed a different kind of protection now, and I needed to learn more about the old ways my grandmother had tried to teach me. The Park Service approved a new position for me, Cultural Resource Specialist, with a focus on Cherokee traditional knowledge. The mountain was closed to winter access indefinitely. Officially, it was due to unstable weather patterns and increased avalanche risk. Unofficially, it was because I convinced my supervisors that some places are too dangerous for humans during certain times of the year. I visit the mountain every summer now, performing the protection ceremonies my grandmother taught me. I maintain the sacred fires and leave offerings at the old sites. So far, it's worked. No more disappearances, no more animal attacks. The creatures are still up there. I can feel them in the deep cold when winter comes, but they stay in the high places now. Climate change brought them down once. It could happen again. That's why I'm telling this story. Not because I want people to believe in monsters, but because I want them to understand that the world is changing in ways we don't fully comprehend. Old boundaries are shifting, Things that used to stay in the far north are moving south. Things that used to sleep through warm winters are staying awake longer. My grandmother used to say that every mountain has its own spirit, its own rules. Grandfather Mountain's rule is simple: respect the cold, or the cold will consume you. Last winter, I got reports of strange sounds coming from the summit during ice storms. Hikers finding oversized footprints on trails that should have been empty. Food going missing from emergency shelters. I drove up to the base of the mountain and looked toward the summit. Even in the broad daylight, I could see shapes moving against the snow. Waiting. Watching. The fire ceremonies are holding for now, but I'm getting older, and I don't know who I can teach to take over when I'm gone. The Cherokee Nation has record of the old protections, but most people think they're just folklore. They're not folklore, they're survival instructions. If you ever find yourself on Grandfather Mountain during a winter storm, remember this: stay away from the high places when the temperature drops below zero. Don't travel alone. Carry lots of fire. And if you hear something whispering in the wind, something that sounds almost human but not quite, don't listen to what it's saying. Turn around and walk away. The mountain will let you leave if you show proper respect. But if you ignore the warnings, if you push too far into places that don't belong to humans anymore, remember my grandmother's words. The cold is patient and the cold is hungry. And once it gets a taste for human warmth, it never forgets. My name is Joseph Whitehawk, and I've been guiding folks through these Smoky Mountains for 14 years now. Most people call me Joe. I know these trails better than the wrinkles on my own hands, and I've led over 500 historical tours through every hidden cove and forgotten settlement these mountains hold. Before I became a park ranger, I was studying to be a preacher. Spent 3 years at seminary, reading the Bible until my eyes burned, learning about good and evil, salvation and damnation. But somewhere along the way, I lost my faith. Started thinking all those old stories about devils and demons were just superstition, tales to scare people into being good. So I dropped out and came to the mountains instead, figuring I'd rather help people discover God's creation than preach about a God I wasn't sure existed anymore. That was 14 years ago. Now I wish I'd never stopped believing, because what I found in these mountains made me understand that evil is very, very real. It started on a Tuesday morning in August 1965. The heat was so thick you could almost chew it, and there wasn't a breath of wind stirring the leaves. I was sitting in the ranger station, looking over some reports, when Emma Tipton knocked on my door. Emma was one of our local historians, a tiny woman with silver hair who knew more about these mountains than anyone alive. "Joe," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I got some hikers yesterday asking about the old church up in Cove Creek. Said they saw something strange up there." I leaned back in my chair. The Cove Creek Church was one of my regular stops, or used to be, built back in the 1842 by settlers who thought they were far enough from civilization to worship however they pleased. The church had been abandoned for over a century, nothing left but crumbling stone foundations and a cemetery full of tilted headstones. "What kind of strange?" I asked. Emma pulled out a small notebook and flipped through the pages. Bob and Mary Peterson from Ohio, nice couple, been hiking these trails for years. They said they heard singing coming from the church ruins around sunset. Old hymns, they thought, but couldn't make out the words exactly. I shrugged. Probably just the wind through the trees. You know how sound carries funny in those narrow coves. "That's what I figured too," Emma said. But then they told me something else. Said they saw a candlelight flickering inside the church foundation. Fresh candles, Joe. Like someone had been holding a service. That got my attention. The Cove Creek site was 3 miles off the main trail, accessible only by foot through some pretty rough country. We didn't get many visitors up there, and certainly no one who'd be hauling candles around. "Kids, probably," I said. "You know how teenagers like to play around in spooky places." Emma nodded, but she looked worried. "Maybe so. But Joe, the Petersons aren't the Yuvan type to make things up. Bob fought in Korea. He's not easily spooked. And there's something else." She flipped to another page in her notebook. "I've been going through the old church records, trying to piece together what happened up there in the 1800s. Found some interesting things about the last preacher they had. Man named Ezekiel Thorne. The name sent a little chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. Thorne came to the settlement in 1859, Emma continued. Folks said he was the most powerful preacher they'd ever heard. Could make grown men weep and sinners fall to their knees just with his words. But there was something wrong about him. The records mention strange practices, services held at midnight, talk of speaking with the dead. What happened to him? That's just it, nobody knows. In the winter of 1860, the whole congregation just vanished. All 19 families. The county sheriff found the church empty, no signs of violence, no note, nothing. It was like they all just walked away in the middle of the night and never came back. I felt that chill again, stronger this time. And you think this has something to do with the Petersons seeing lights? Emma closed her notebook and stood up. I think that church has never been properly investigated. Maybe it's time someone took a look. After Emma left, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring out the window at the green mountains rising in the distance. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in seminary to think logically about spiritual matters, said it was probably nothing. Kids with candles, tricks of light and shadow, maybe some drifters using the ruins for shelter. But another part of me, a part I'd been trying to ignore for 14 years, whispered that some places hold on to their darkness long after the people are gone. I made my decision. I'd hike up to Cove Creek the next morning and take a look around. Just a routine site. Inspection, nothing more. Check for vandalism. Make sure the historical markers were still in place. Maybe look for signs of recent camping. What I found up there changed everything I thought I knew about good and evil, about faith and doubt, about the thin line between the living and the dead. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have stayed in the valley and never set foot on that trail. But sometimes you have to walk into the darkness to understand why the light matters. And sometimes the darkness has been waiting for you all along. I started up the Cove Creek Trail at first light, my backpack loaded with the usual gear: camera, notebook, first aid kit, and a thermos of coffee that Emma had pressed on me before I left the station. The trail was familiar under my boots, winding through stands of tulip poplar and mountain laurel, crossing 3 small streams before it started climbing toward the cove. The hike normally took about an hour and a half, but that morning, something felt off from the start. The woods were too quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of squirrels in the trees, not even the buzz of insects, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. By the time I reached the old church site, sweat was running down my back, despite the early morning cool. The ruins sat in a small clearing, surrounded by a broken stone wall that had once marked the church grounds. The foundation stones were still there, outlining where the building had stood, with gaps for the door and windows. Wild grapevines had grown over most of it, and saplings pushed up through cracks in the old floor. The cemetery was behind the church, maybe 20 headstones still standing, though many had fallen over or broken apart. Some of the names were still readable. Sarah Caldwell, beloved wife, 1,823 to 1,859. Thomas Ridge, called home, 1,841 to 1,860. Most of the dates ended in 1860, right around the time everyone disappeared. I started with the church foundation, looking for signs of recent activity. It didn't take long to find them. In what would have been the front of the church, near where the altar would have stood, someone had cleared away the vines and debris. The old foundation stones had been scrubbed clean, and there were dark stains on them that looked suspiciously like candle wax. But that wasn't the strangest part. Carved into the largest foundation stone, someone had scratched words in what looked like Latin: Servus Tenebrarum Aeternum. My seminary training kicked in, and I translated it slowly. Servant of darkness eternal. I pulled out my camera and snapped several pictures, then moved on to check the cemetery. Most of the graves looked undisturbed, but there was something wrong with the ground around them. The grass was dead in perfect circles around each headstone, as if something had poisoned the earth. And the temperature, God, it was cold back there, had to be 20 degrees cooler than the rest of the clearing, cold enough that I could see my breath. That's when I found the visitor log. It was sitting on top of a broken headstone, a simple spiral notebook with a pencil tied to it with string. Park Service regulations required us to maintain visitor logs at historical sites. But I knew for certain we'd never put one at Cove Creek. The site was too remote, too lightly visited. I opened the notebook with hands that had started shaking, though I told myself it was just from the cold. The first entry was dated 3 days ago. Bob and Mary Peterson, Dayton, OH. Beautiful site, heard lovely singing. Normal enough, but as I flipped through the pages, my blood started turning to ice water. There were entries going back weeks, months, and years. Names and dates and comments written in different hands, different pens, different pencils. The 15th of June, 1962, Thomas Crawford, Atlanta, GA. Came for the evening service. Powerful preaching. The 3rd of August, 1959, Helen Morrison, Nashville, TN. Brother Ezekiel spoke the truth tonight. I am saved. The 30th of May, 1955, James Whitfield, Knoxville, TN. The darkness has such beautiful light. My hands were shaking harder now as I flipped to the very back of the notebook. The last entry was from yesterday. We have been waiting for the ranger. He will come tomorrow. E.T. E.T. Ezekiel Thorne, the preacher who had disappeared over a century ago. I dropped the notebook like it was on fire and stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. This had to be some kind of joke. Maybe kids from one of the local high schools playing an elaborate prank. People didn't write in visitor logs for 100 years. Dead preachers didn't leave messages for park rangers. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew something was wrong with this place. The cold, the dead grass, the absolute silence of the woods. None of it was natural. I forced myself to pick up the notebook again and stuff it into my backpack. Evidence, I told myself. Whatever was going on here, I needed evidence. That's when I heard the singing. It started low and far away, like voices carrying on the wind. But there was no wind. The air was as still as death. The voices grew stronger, closer, and I realized they were singing hymns, old hymns I remembered from my seminary days. Amazing Grace first, then How Great Thou Art. But there was something wrong with the words. They were backwards. The melody was right, but the words were twisted, corrupted, like someone had taken beautiful songs and turned them inside out. The singing was coming from the church foundation. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get back on the trail and not stop until I reached my truck. But I was a park ranger. Damn it. If someone was trespassing on park land, conducting some kind of weird ritual, it was my job to investigate. I walked slowly toward the foundation, my camera ready, the singing. I grew louder as I approached, and I could make out individual voices now. A whole choir of them, men and women and even children. But when I reached the foundation and looked inside, there was no one there. The singing stopped instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was worse than the singing. It pressed against my ears like water, and I realized I was holding my breath. The foundation was empty except for the vines and the altar stone, with its Latin carving, but I could feel eyes watching me. Dozens of eyes, maybe hundreds, all staring at me from places I couldn't see. I raised my camera and took a picture of the empty foundation. The flash went off, blindingly bright in the dim light under the trees. When my vision cleared, there were people standing in the foundation. Not solid people. I could see through them like they were made of smoke and shadow. But they were there. Men in old-fashioned black suits, women in long dresses with their hair pinned up, children in simple work clothes. All of them staring at me with dark, empty eyes. At the center of the group, standing behind the altar stone, was a tall man in black robes. His face was pale as bone, and his eyes, God help me, his eyes were pits of red fire. In his hands he held a book, not a Bible, but something else, something that seemed to suck the light out of the air around it. The man smiled, showing teeth like broken glass, and spoke in a voice that crawled inside my head like spiders. "Welcome, Brother Whitehawk. We've been waiting for you." I ran. I don't remember much about the trip back down the trail. My feet found their own way while my mind reeled with what I'd seen. Ghosts, spirits. Whatever you wanted to call them, they were real, and they knew my name. By the time I reached my truck, I'd almost convinced myself it was a hallucination. Heat exhaustion, maybe, or altitude sickness. People didn't see dead congregations, conducting services in ruined churches. Former seminary students definitely didn't see demonic preachers who'd been dead for over a century. But when I got back to the station and developed the film for my camera, all my rational explanations crumbled. The first few pictures looked normal: the foundation stones, the cemetery, the visitor log. But the last picture, the one I'd taken of the empty foundation just before I saw the ghosts, showed something that made my blood freeze. In the photograph, clear as day, were 19 people standing in the church foundation. Men, women, and children in old-fashioned clothes, all staring directly at the camera. And behind them, towering over the altar stone with his arms raised toward the sky, was the man in black robes. Ezekiel Thorne was real, and he was waiting for me to come back. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those empty, staring faces and heard that backwards hymn singing in my head. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, staring at the photograph and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Double exposure, maybe, or some kind of chemical reaction in the film development. But I'd been taking pictures for years, and I'd never seen anything like this. By morning, I'd made two decisions. First, I was going back to Cove Creek, and second, I wasn't going alone. Susan Mackenzie was the only other ranger at our station who had experience with historical sites. She was younger than me, maybe 30, with red hair and a no-nonsense attitude that had gotten her through situations that would have sent most people running. If anyone could help me figure out what was happening at the old church, it was Susan. I found her in the equipment shed, checking supplies for a trail maintenance crew. "Susan," I said, "I need your help with something strange up at Cove Creek." She looked up from her clipboard. "Strange how?" I pulled out the photograph and handed it to her. She studied it for a long moment, her face going pale. "Where did you take this?" she asked. "At the old church site yesterday. I was alone when I took it. The foundation was empty." Susan handed the photo back to me like it might bite her. "Joe, this looks like one of those old Civil War ghost pictures you see in books. You know, double exposure tricks." "That's what I thought too," I said. "But I need someone to come up there with me and verify what I'm seeing. Will you do it?" She was quiet for a minute, chewing on her lower lip, the way she did when she was thinking hard. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but we go prepared. Extra cameras, recording equipment, first aid kit, and if things get weird, we leave immediately. Deal?" "Deal." We started up the trail at noon, both of us loaded down with gear. The woods were still unnaturally quiet, but Susan didn't seem to notice at first. She was busy taking notes about trail conditions and marking spots where erosion had damaged the path. It wasn't until we crossed the second stream that she stopped and looked around. "Joe," she said, "where are all the birds? I noticed that yesterday. Probably just the heat." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't the heat. Birds didn't abandon an entire mountainside because of hot weather. Something had scared them away. We reached the church site just after 2 o'clock. Susan walked around the foundation, taking pictures and making notes, while I checked the cemetery again. The visitor log was still there on the broken headstone, and when I opened it, there was a new entry. The 15th of August 1965, Susan Mackenzie, National Park Service. "Welcome, sister. Your faith will be tested today. T.T." "Susan," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come, look at this." She walked over and read the entry, her face going white. "I didn't write this. Joe, I've never even been to this site before." "I know. But look at the handwriting. It's the same as the other old entries." Susan grabbed the notebook and flipped through it, reading the impossible dates and signatures. "This is someone's idea of a sick joke. It has to be." That's when we heard the child crying. It was coming from the cemetery, a soft sobbing that tugged at your heart and made you want to run toward it to help. Susan and I looked at each other, then moved carefully toward the sound. The crying was coming from behind the largest headstone, a tall granite marker that read, "Ezekiel Thorne, Shepherd of the Flock, 1820. The death date had been left blank. As we approached, the crying got louder, more desperate. It sounded like a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. "Hello?" Susan called. "Are you hurt? We're park rangers. We can help you." The crying stopped instantly. Susan walked around the headstone, and I heard her gasp. When I joined her, I saw what had shocked her. There was a fresh grave behind Thorne's marker, not old and overgrown like the others, but newly dug, with dark earth piled around the edges. and sticking out of the dirt was a small white hand. "Oh God," Susan whispered. "Joe, there's a child buried here." I knelt down and brushed dirt away from the hand. It was cold as ice, but when I touched it, the fingers moved. The hand grabbed mine and squeezed. I jerked backwards so hard I fell on my rear end, pulling Susan with me. We scrambled away from the grave, both of us breathing hard. "We need to call the sheriff," Susan said, "if there's a body." "Look at the hand again," I said. Susan turned back toward the grave, and I watched her face change. The hand was gone. The dirt was smooth and undisturbed, covered with grass that looked like it had been growing there for years. "It was there," she said. "I saw it. You touched it." "I know, but it's gone now." We spent the next hour searching, with the cemetery, looking for any sign of disturbance, any indication that someone had been digging. We found nothing. The graves were all old, all untouched, all exactly as they should be, but the temperature kept dropping. By 4 o'clock, it was so cold we could see our breath, even though it was 90 degrees down in the valley, and the feeling of being watched was getting stronger. "Joe," Susan said, "I think we should leave." I wanted to agree with her. Every nerve in my body was screaming that we needed to get away from this place. But I was a former seminary student, and I needed to understand what was happening here. "Let's check the church foundation one more time," I said. "Then we'll go." As we approached the foundation, I noticed that the altar stone was different. The Latin carving was still there, but now there were other markings around it. Symbols that hurt to look at, lines and curves that seemed to twist in ways that geometry shouldn't allow. Susan walked up to the stone and ran her fingers over the new carvings. "These weren't here yesterday, were they?" "No, someone's been here since." Susan started screaming. Not the kind of scream you hear when someone's hurt or scared, but something else entirely. A sound that came from deep in her throat, wordless and wild and full of a terror so pure it made my bones ache. And then she started speaking in tongues. I'd heard it before in church, back when I still believed. The gift of speaking in languages no one understood, words that supposedly came straight from God. But what came out of Susan's mouth wasn't holy. The words were harsh and guttural, full of consonants that scraped against each other like broken glass. Her eyes had rolled back in her head, showing only white, and her body was rigid as a board. The words poured out of her mouth in a stream, and even though I couldn't understand them, I knew they were wrong. They were the opposite of prayer, the opposite of blessing, the opposite of everything good and holy in the world. I grabbed her shoulders and shook her. "Susan, Susan, snap out of it!" The foreign words stopped, and she looked at me with eyes that weren't her own. When she spoke, it was in a man's voice, deep and cultured and absolutely confident. "She belongs to me now, Brother Whitehawk. As will you, when the sun sets and the real service begins." Susan's face twisted into a smile that was all wrong for her features. "We have such plans for you both. Such beautiful, terrible plans." I did the only thing I could think of. I slapped her across the face. Hard. Susan blinked, staggered, and looked around in confusion. "Joe, what happened? Why are we? Oh God, it's so cold." "We're leaving," I said, grabbing her arm. "Right now." But as we turned to go, I heard laughter behind us, low and mocking and full of a malice that made my skin crawl. When I looked back at the foundation, there was no one there. But carved into the altar stone, in letters that seemed to glow with their own dark light, were new words. "Tonight, when the moon is dark, I will have my congregation complete." We ran down that trail faster than I'd ever moved in my life, Susan stumbling beside me, both of us too scared to look back. By the time we reached the truck, the sun was setting behind the mountains, and the first stars were appearing in the sky. "Joe," Susan said as we drove back to town, "I can't remember what happened up there. After I touched that stone, everything goes blank until you slapped me." I didn't tell her about the voice, about the promise that she belonged to Ezekiel Thorne now. I didn't tell her about the new words on the altar stone, or about the laughter that had followed us down the trail, but I knew we hadn't seen the last of the shadow preacher. He had plans for us, plans that would come to fruition when the moon was dark and the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. And tomorrow night, there would be no moon at all. I spent that night researching everything I could find about Ezekiel Thorne and the disappeared congregation. Emma Tipton had given me access to the County Historical Society records, and what I found there made my blood run cold. Thorne hadn't been an ordinary preacher. The records showed he'd come to Cove Creek from somewhere down south, claiming to have received a calling to minister to the mountain folk. But the settlers who remembered his arrival described strange things: animals dying for no reason, crops failing, children having nightmares about a dark man who spoke to them in their sleep. The church services had started normally enough, but by 1860, people were reporting that Thorne's sermons had changed. He spoke about serving powers older than God, about finding salvation through submission to darkness. He claimed he could speak with the dead, could grant eternal life to those faithful enough to accept his teachings. The last entry in the records was from a farmer named William Caldwell, dated the 15th of January, 1860. The preacher ain't preaching from the Bible no more. He's got another book, one that bleeds when he opens it. My Sarah went to service last night and came home speaking words I never heard before. I fear for our souls. 3 days later, everyone in the settlement vanished. The sheriff's report from 1,860 was brief but chilling. 19 families, gone without a trace. No signs of violence, no indication they'd packed to leave. Their houses were found with meals still on the tables, fires still burning in the hearths. The only thing missing was the people. And in the church, the sheriff had found the altar stone carved with symbols too foul to describe and stained with what looked like blood. I closed the records and sat back in my chair, my hands shaking. Ezekiel Thorne had been more than just a preacher. He'd been something else, something that had corrupted an entire community and led them. Where? The answer came to me as I remembered Susan's blank eyes and the voice that had spoken through her mouth. She belongs to me now. Thorne hadn't killed the congregation. He'd claimed their souls. The phone rang at 3 a.m. It was Susan, and her voice was strange, distant. "Joe," she said, "I need to go back to the church." "Susan, it's the middle of the night. You need to stay away from that place." "I can hear them calling me," she said. "The children are crying, Joe. They need help." "Susan, listen to me. Don't go up there. Whatever you're hearing, it's not real." But the line had gone dead. I threw on my clothes and grabbed my truck keys, my heart hammering against my ribs. If Susan went back to Cove Creek alone, I didn't think she'd be coming back. The drive up the mountain seemed to take forever. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, and more than once I thought I saw figures standing at the edge of the road, watching me pass. But when I looked in my mirrors, there was nothing there. Susan's Ranger truck was parked at the trailhead, empty. I grabbed my flashlight and started up the trail, moving as fast as I dared in the darkness. The woods were even quieter than before, not just silent, but somehow absent, as if the very life had been drained out of them. When I reached the church site, I saw lights flickering in the foundation. Candle light, dozens of candles arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. And standing among them, perfectly still and staring straight ahead, was Susan. She wasn't alone. The ghost congregation was back, more solid than before, more real. Men and women and children in old-fashioned clothes, all facing the altar stone where Ezekiel Thorne stood with his arms raised toward the moonless sky. But these weren't the same spirits I'd seen before. These people looked wrong. Their skin was gray as ash, their eyes were black, holes in their faces, and when they opened their mouths to sing, I could see that their tongues had been cut out. Thorne was exactly as I'd seen him before, tall and gaunt in his black robes, but now I could see what he really was. His face was a skull with parchment stretched over the bones, and where his eyes should have been, there were pits of red fire. In his hands he held the book I'd glimpsed before, not paper and leather, but something that looked like it was made from human skin and bound with sinew. When he spoke, his voice echoed inside my skull. "Welcome, Brother Whitehawk. You're just in time for the final service. Your colleague has already accepted salvation. Now it's your turn." Susan turned to look at me, and I saw that her eyes had gone completely black. When she smiled, her teeth were stained with blood. "Join us, Joe," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own anymore. "It's beautiful here. There's no pain, no doubt, no fear, only service to the eternal darkness." I backed away, my hand reaching instinctively for the cross I'd worn around my neck since seminary. I'd stopped believing in its power years ago, but now it was the only thing between me and whatever Thorn had become. "You can't have her," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "And you can't have me." Thorn laughed, a sound like bones breaking. "Can't I? Look around you, brother. Look at my congregation." They all said the same thing once upon a time, but in the end, they all knelt before the true power. The ghostly congregation began to move forward, surrounding me in a circle of gray flesh and black eyes. Their mouths opened and closed silently, as if they were trying to scream but had forgotten how. "They gave me their souls willingly," Thorn continued, "in exchange for eternal life, eternal service. Death held no power over them anymore. Pain became pleasure, despair became joy, and doubt." He smiled, showing teeth like broken glass. "Doubt became faith." I pulled the cross from under my shirt and held it up. The metal was warm against my palm, and for a moment, the spirits recoiled. "I don't doubt anymore," I said. "I believe in God, and I believe in evil, and I know which one you serve." Thorn's laugh grew louder. "Your God abandoned this place long ago, brother. These mountains belong to older powers now, darker truths. Your little cross is nothing against the force that flows through me." He opened the book in his hands, and I heard it scream. The sound was like 1,000 voices crying out in agony, and the very air around the altar began to ripple and tear. Through the holes in reality, I could see something vast and hungry moving in the darkness beyond. "Kneel," Thorn commanded, and the power in his voice hit me like a physical blow. My knees buckled, and I felt myself starting to fall. But then I remembered something from my seminary days, something my professor had said, about faith and doubt. It's not the absence of fear that makes you faithful. It's doing what's right despite the fear. I was terrified. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to run, to give up, to let Thorn have what he wanted. But Susan was standing there with blood on her teeth and emptiness in her eyes, and 19 other souls were trapped in this horrible half-life, and someone had to try to set them free. I pressed the cross to my forehead and began to pray. Not the formal prayers I'd learned in seminary, but something from the heart. Something desperate and real and absolutely honest. "God, if you're there, if you're listening, help me. I don't know if I believe in you anymore, but I believe in good and evil, and I know this is wrong. Help me save Susan. Help me save them all." The cross grew warm in my hands, then hot, then blazing. Light poured out of it, not the harsh glare of electric bulbs, but something softer and infinitely more powerful. The ghost congregation shrieked and fell back, their gray flesh smoking where the light touched them. Thorn snarled and raised his book higher. "Your faith is weak, brother. Your doubt is stronger." "Maybe," I said, getting to my feet. "But even weak faith is stronger than strong evil." I walked forward, holding the cross like a torch. The spirits scattered before me, their forms growing thinner and more transparent with each step. When I reached Susan, I touched the cross to her forehead. She screamed and collapsed, but when she opened her eyes, they were her own again. "Joe?" she whispered. "What? Where are we?" "Getting out of here," I said, helping her to her feet. But Thorn wasn't finished. His form was growing larger, more monstrous, as whatever was behind the torn reality poured its power into him. His robes billowed out like wings, and his skull face stretched into something that barely looked human. "You cannot destroy me," he roared. "I am eternal. I am—" "You're dead," I said simply. "You've been dead for over a century, and it's time you accepted that." I pressed the cross against the altar stone, right over the Latin inscription. The stone cracked with a sound like thunder, and light poured out of the crack like water from a broken dam. Thorn let out a scream that shattered the windows of reality itself. His form began to unravel, the shadows that made up his body streaming away like smoke in a hurricane. "This isn't over," he shrieked as he dissolved. "There are other churches, other congregations. The darkness is everywhere." And then he was gone, and the ghost congregation with him. The altar stone crumbled to dust, the candles went out, and the terrible cold that had gripped the place lifted like a fever breaking. Susan and I stood in the ruins of the church, holding each other and shaking, watching the first light of dawn creep over the mountains. "Is it over?" she asked. I looked at the pile of dust that had been the altar stone, then at the cemetery, where the grass was already starting to turn green again. "For this place," I said. "Yes," I think it's over. But I remembered Thorne's last words, and I knew our work wasn't finished. There were other dark places in these mountains, other forgotten churches where evil might have taken root. And someone would have to find them. The official report said that the Cove Creek Historical Site was closed due to structural instability in the foundation stones. The cemetery was deemed unsafe for visitors, and the trail was rerouted around the area entirely. The Park Service put up signs warning people to stay away, and most folks listened. Susan and I never talked about what really happened that night. She remembered fragments, the cold, the voices, the feeling of being pulled towards something terrible. But the details faded from her memory like a bad dream. Maybe that was for the best. I, on the other hand, remembered everything. The feel of the cross burning in my hands, the sound of Thorne's scream as he dissolved, the moment when faith and terror collided in my heart and somehow faith won. It changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. 3 months after the incident, I left the Park Service. The mountains were still beautiful, still spoke of God's creation, but I couldn't look at them the same way anymore. I knew there were dark places hidden in those hills, places where evil had been invited in and never properly cast out. I went back to seminary, a different one this time, one that took seriously the idea that spiritual warfare was more than just metaphor. I studied exorcism, deliverance ministry, the thin places where the natural and supernatural worlds touched. My professors thought I was obsessed with demons and devils, but they hadn't seen what I'd seen. When I graduated, I didn't take a church in some comfortable suburb. Instead, I became what you might call a traveling minister. I go to the remote places, the forgotten settlements, the old churches that have been abandoned for decades or centuries. I look for signs of corruption, for places where the darkness has taken root. You'd be surprised how many I've found. There was a church in North Carolina where the congregation disappeared in 1923, leaving behind only blood on the walls and a Bible written in a language that doesn't exist. A chapel in Virginia where hikers reported hearing Latin chants at midnight, even though the building had been empty for 80 years. A meeting house in Kentucky where every baby born to the congregation was stillborn until the parents started offering them to something that lived in the basement. I've cleansed 17 sites so far, and I know there are more out there. Thorne was right about one thing: the darkness is everywhere, waiting for an invitation, waiting for someone to lose faith and open the door. But light is everywhere too. Sometimes it comes in the form of a cross getting hot in your hands. Sometimes it's the memory of hymns sung in honest worship instead of mockery. Sometimes it's just the stubborn refusal to give up, even when you're scared out of your mind and not sure God is listening. I keep in touch with Emma Tipton, who still works at the Historical Society. She sends me reports of strange happenings in old religious sites across the region. Most of them turn out to be nothing: kids playing pranks, natural phenomena, overactive imaginations. But some require a visit from a former park ranger with a strong cross and a faith rebuilt in the fires of genuine terror. Last week, Emma called me about a church in West Virginia, built in 1847, abandoned in 1889, when the entire congregation vanished during a Christmas Eve service. The local sheriff's department had received reports of Christmas carols being sung in the ruins, even though it was July. The songs were beautiful. Witnesses said, but they made children cry and dogs howl. I'll be driving up there tomorrow morning. My truck is loaded with the tools of my new trade: crosses blessed by 7 different denominations, holy water from a dozen sources, sage for cleansing, salt for protection. And in the glove compartment, wrapped in silk, is the same cross that saved Susan and me at Cove Creek. I don't know what I'll find in West Virginia, but I know that somewhere in those mountains, in the ruins of another forgotten church, something dark is pretending to worship God while serving a very different master. And I know that faith, even faith as small and doubtful as mine, can drive back the darkness, one abandoned church at a time. The mountains are still beautiful. God's creation still speaks of wonder and glory, and the kind of love that makes galaxies spin and flowers bloom. But there are shadows in those hills, places where the light doesn't reach, where people invited in things that should to have stayed buried. Someone has to find those places. Someone has to clean them out. Someone has to stand between the darkness and the light and remember that even the smallest flame can hold back an ocean of shadow. My name is Joseph Whitehawk, and this is what I do now. This is what I believe in. This is why I finally found my faith again, in the very last place I expected to look. In the ruins of a church where evil wore the mask of salvation, and light came from a cross held by shaking hands in the darkest hour before dawn. If you ever find yourself in the mountains, in some remote place where old churches sit empty and forgotten, remember this. Some places hold on to their darkness long after the people are gone. But light is stronger than shadow, love is more powerful than hate, and faith, even faith as fragile as spider silk, can move mountains, even mountains full of ghosts,